I was thinking that if I said I'd like to ask unanimous consent, that would bring out the Republicans quickly. Whoop.
It worked.
Well, we'll get started in a minute. The meeting of the committee will come to order. We're going to start off this markup with opening statements, and without objection, the chair and the ranking member will have 5 minutes, and each member thereafter will be given 1 minute for opening statements. Today, this committee has a big job. Our nation's economy is floundering, and we need to respond. We're in a deep and long recession. Our unemployment rate is over 7% and growing. We urgently need an economic recovery package, and we need it immediately. Our committee has jurisdiction over 3 of the major pieces of the economic recovery package, and that is what we will be considering today. The first piece is an investment in expanding broadband Internet access, so that businesses and households in rural and other underserved areas can link to the global economy. Broadband investments are important because they have a tremendous multiplier effect on our economy. The second piece involves investments in clean energy technologies. These investments in renewable energy, smart transmission grids, and energy efficiency put people to work, clean our environment, and reduce our dependence on foreign oil. The final and biggest piece involves investments in health. We need to create new jobs by investing in health information technology. We need to help workers hurt by the recession by providing health insurance. And we need to strengthen a key safety net by increasing the federal contribution to Medicaid. Taking these steps, especially raising the federal Medicaid contribution, will increase state spending and help our economies recover. This is a lot to do, but it is essential. As people lose their jobs, they lose their access to health insurance, and without a regular income, they cannot afford to buy their own coverage. If we don't act now, the recession will accelerate. Over 6 million Americans will lose their health insurance. States will cut Medicaid, and sick, chronically ill, and disabled Americans will be badly hurt. In total, over 50 million Americans could end up without any kind of health insurance at all. Given the magnitude of the economic problems our nation faces, our task today will not be easy. That is why I'm asking for members' cooperation and assistance in moving this legislation forward. We've been given only a short window to consider this package, so we must report this bill by the end of the day. Like many members on both sides of the aisle, I wish that we could have taken more time, but this is not an option. I've discussed this situation with Mr. Barton. I've told him that my intention is to allot no more than 2 hours to consideration of the broadband provisions, no more than 2 hours to consideration of the energy provisions, and no more than 6 hours for consideration of the health provisions. And I hope we can move faster than this. But I am committed within the time we have available to allow members the chance to offer and debate the most important amendments. In the interests of the committee, the Congress, the uninsured, the economy, and the American people, I urge us all to act pragmatically, quickly, and with mutual resolve to pass this legislation and start our nation on the path to economic recovery. Mr. Barton, I want to recognize you for opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I give my opening statement, I would like to take a point of personal privilege. I know that you know this, but our colleague, Mr. Rick Boucher of Virginia, his mother has passed away. He's not here because of attending the funeral arrangements. And Mr. Chairman, those of us that pray, our prayers are with Mr. Boucher. And I would ask unanimous consent if we could have a moment of silence for Mr. Boucher and his family.
Without objection, we will ask for a moment of silence.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, today we are going to mark up 5 different committee prints in the areas of broadband, internet deployment, energy, and 3 healthcare titles represent the provisions of our committee's jurisdiction in the stimulus package that the President and the Democrat majorities are putting together. As I've told you, and I want to tell the audience, I respect the right of a new president to have his agenda, or her agenda, as the case may be, put before the American people. And so in our discussions, as you correctly pointed out, I did agree to the time frame that you just announced. Having said that, I think it is abominable that a bill that's 269 pages that we don't yet have a correct CBO score on is going to be the item, the object of a one-day markup and no hearing. We've not even had one hearing in this Congress on these issues. That, again, I know the pressure that you're under, Mr. Chairman, but it is truly an insult to this committee, and I would say to the committee system, that we couldn't have several weeks to review this, perhaps have 3 hearings on each section of a hearing on each section of the bill, so that we could get a little bit more information before we make some of these decisions. I have told my members that we are going to abide by the time limits, not going to be obstructionist, but we are going to offer a number of what we think are very constructive amendments, and I would hope that the majority would listen to the brief debate on each of these amendments and perhaps allow the committee to work its will on some parts of the bill. Again, there are 269 text pages in this bill, and we don't even yet have a CBO score on it. With regard to some of the sections in the bill, the base print in the energy title has a provision that if our efforts to conserve energy bear fruit and we actually use less electricity, we give the governor of the state the authority to approve the right of the utilities providing electricity to raise their rates to offset the revenue loss because of the conservation gains. In other words, the bill before us has a federal guarantee of revenue to the generating companies that are providing electricity of America. I think that is very anti-market, very anti-competitive, and so, Mr. Chairman, on that amendment you can expect a spirited debate. In the health IT title, I want to commend you and others. A large part of the text in the Dingell-Pallone Barton Deal bill on health IT is in the base text. Not all of it, but some of it. I don't think the privacy protections we had, Mr. Markey and myself were able to get into the bill last year, provision that gave the patient the right to give consent before certain sensitive medical information was shared. That has been dropped. And so I'm not sure if we have an amendment on that, but that is one of the flaws in the health IT title. We also have a provision in the health title that gives individuals who lose their jobs but have private insurance the right to continue that private insurance, and the government will pick up the health care premium, 65% of the health care premium. The individual has to pay 35%. On the surface, that's not a automatically bad idea, but there's no means test or revenue test. If a stockbroker working for Goldman Sachs with a net worth of $100 million loses his or her job under this bill, the government picks up 65% of their health care costs, and if that person goes back to work, as I understand the bill, the government still picks up the health care cost of their health care premium. That's not right. And so we're going to have some amendments that deal with that, Mr. Chairman. I've got about 6 or 7 other pages here of comments, but I'm going to, in the spirit of trying to move the process, just ask that my entire written statement be put in the record and yield back my time. Again, we do appreciate the opportunity to have some debate on this, and I guess before I end, I should recognize that we do have a new member of the committee, Mr. Steve Scalise, and I'm told that before we actually start the markup, we're going to do the formalities to approve him being on the committee, and we want to welcome Mr. Scalise to the committee. We remember with fondness former Chairman Billy Tozan from the great state of Louisiana, who was a valuable member, I might add, on both sides of the aisle at various times. Mr. Scalise is joining us, and we know that he's going to bring a Louisiana perspective to the committee's deliberations.
Thank you, Mr. Barton. We want to welcome Mr. Scalise to our committee, and we want to tell him that we welcome him in Louisiana tradition if he wishes to join us at some point. He can serve on both sides of the aisle as well. Thank you. We'll now proceed to opening statements from members who wish to make them, but let me ask unanimous consent that all members may have an opportunity to submit an opening statement in its entirety in the record, and without objection, that'll be the order. Mr. Markey?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, the broadband provisions of the recovery package underscore the need to get a better assessment of America's broadband deployment and service attributes. The provisions will also spark sorely needed economic development and job creation and ensure that the public derives the maximum utilization of the broadband networks the taxpayers finance through the grant program contained in the bill. The energy provisions contain helpful investments that will ensure that promising technologies like plug-in hybrid batteries and the latest solar cells, also promoting more R&D from our nation's universities so that we build a smarter electricity grid will make our homes and buildings more efficient. And in the area of health IT, I'm glad to say that many of the provisions which Congressman Rahm Emanuel and Lois Capps and I had in our Trust Act are in. Security breach notification, restrictions on the sale of medical records, audit trails are required, State Attorney General enforcement is required as well. I think on the whole we have a great package here. Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Markey. Mr. Upton?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, join with Mr. Barton in saying that I'm very disappointed with the with the process that we're seeing today. A bill that's going to cost more than $50 billion, B as in big, in actual spending. No hearings, no subcommittee markups, full committee with a timeline set by the Democratic leadership to start and finish today, so that it can possibly be up on the House floor as early as really the first business day of next week, perhaps. There is no reason for that process to start off that way. Often the analogy to sausage is used for legislation. Well, with apologies to my Georgia friends, I would have to say that this process is more like bad sausage with a big dose of peanut butter. And I'm not sure that that's the right way that we ought to go. These are challenging times, and they, in fact, demand nothing less than bipartisan cooperation and solutions to address the recession that not only Michigan is in big time, but obviously the rest of the country as well. And I look forward to offering a number of constructive, productive amendments that I would hope would have some bipartisan support along with my other colleagues, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Upton. Chair would like to now recognize the Chairman Emeritus of the committee, Mr. Dingell.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your courtesy. I respectfully ask that my opening statement be submitted for the record. But before I do, I want to offer two brief comments. We're discussing funding for rural broadband infrastructure. It is important that we carefully define underserved and unserved areas in the committee report. The legislation gives discretion to the FCC, but gives no outline of what the FCC will consider as it does so. I am concerned that they might not define these areas properly. I also believe that we are considering an FMAP increase, and that in doing so we should take consideration of the length of the recession in some of the hardest hit states like Michigan. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Dingell. Mr. Deal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My remarks will primarily concentrate on the health care portion of this legislation, and I am concerned that this very large spending bill may not be the answer to providing the kind of health care that we need in this country. In fact, many economists have indicated that the Great Depression was in fact lengthened by many of the spending programs of the New Deal. While I agree that Congress needs to ensure that everyone has access to health care, we need to be sure at the same time that the mechanisms through which this goal is achieved should focus on providers and patients by promoting competition, choice, and transparency of health care costs, not on large-scale expansion of government programs that are already on the road to insolvency. In fact, in only 2 years, this legislation is estimated to increase the federal share of the Medicaid program by a whopping $87 billion alone. So what is also troubling is the fact that billions of these taxpayer dollars may be used to pay for health care for illegal immigrants if steps are not taken to revisit the provisions that were contained within last week's S-CHIP legislation passed by the House. The American people, I don't believe, want more welfare. They want more freedom. They want more innovation, more efficiency, and more accountability in welfare programs like Medicaid. I believe the true way to stimulate the economy in our nation's health care sector is to bring price transparency of medical items and services to the forefront, benefiting patients and providers, the insured as well as the uninsured. As many of you will recall, I attempted to offer several amendments during committee proceedings last fall to address this lack of price transparency in the health care arena. We believe that we have taken those concepts and refined them, and hopefully members of this committee will be able to support them today. It bears repeating that the number one cause of personal bankruptcy in this country are exorbitant medical bills which American families on Main Street simply cannot pay. With that in mind, if we really want to stimulate the economy and protect hardworking American families, it is critical that we include these transparency provisions within this legislation. I'm pleased to see that the leadership is prioritizing health care information technology, and I certainly think that is a goal that is worthy of being reached. I would have hoped that it would have come before this committee on its own right as a freestanding bill. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for bringing this through at least a semblance of regular order, and hopefully we will be able to address it in that regard.
Thank you, Mr. Deal. Did you want to say one last thought?
I couldn't tell whether the clock sort of skipped on me there. Is my time up?
Yes.
Well, thank you very much. I'll conclude.
Thank you, Mr. Deal. Mr. Pallone.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to just talk about the health provisions in the interest of saving time. The health provisions that we're marking up today accomplish three important goals. First, they will help jumpstart the economy. Second, they will protect access to health coverage. And third, these provisions invest in the future of our nation's healthcare system. The key health provisions of this package would provide billions of dollars in fiscal relief in order to help states maintain their Medicaid programs at a time when their revenues are decreasing and demand for services are increasing. It would provide access to health coverage for the recently unemployed by improving COBRA coverage and a new Medicaid state option. And finally, the package would modernize our nation's healthcare system by investing $20 billion in health information technology. Mr. Chairman, now is not the time for the faint-hearted. Now is the time for bold action. This package will help jumpstart our economy and help ensure millions of Americans while investing in their future. And I urge my colleagues to support these provisions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pallone. Gentleman from Kentucky.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. And I would say that everyone on this side of the aisle certainly wants to have an open forum and listen to the discussion of the Obama administration's proposals in energy and health care and in telecom. And we would like to be unbiased in our approach to this issue. But I must say that when in one day, in an effort to get the stimulus package out the door, we're making substantive changes in laws in energy, in healthcare, and in telecom, major substantive changes. And on the healthcare provision alone, in the next 3 years, under this proposal, we're spending $89.1 billion, and we do not know for certain what the cost is on the energy package or the telecom package. So I think that the process, and to the extent that many of us simply are not aware of the provisions and have the opportunity for an open debate, is disappointing. But recognizing the importance of moving forward, we do look forward in offering some amendments that we think can help improve it, and we appreciate this opportunity.
Thank you very much. Gentlelady from California, Ms. Escher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for scheduling this all-important markup as we work for a recovery of our national economy. There are three things that economists from all parts of the ideological spectrum have advised us that are amongst the most important investments for us to make, that they will not only help stimulate today, but lay the groundwork for America's future. One is the grid, to upgrade it, to reform it, to revise it. The other is health information technology, which is included in this, as is the first that I just mentioned. And the third is broadband. We know that our country has the undistinguished position of being anywhere from 15th to 17th in the world in broadband penetration. And so we are taking steps in this legislation to correct that. In my view, America should be number one. We should not settle for anything less. Included in this bill is something that is very important, and that is net neutrality. Certainly some of my Republican friends and Democrats and the Bells will argue that this will deter carriers from applying for the funding. My response, and I think our joint response, should be that these are public dollars and that networks built with this funding should be open and should not block certain applications or content. So I'm very pleased about what's in the bill. And I also would say to those that are saying we're moving too quickly, there's an old saying that some can watch while Rome burns. We do not have the time to burn time while America's economy is falling down in cracks and pieces around us. This is as urgent as it comes, and that's why I'm proud to support it. I do wish that there were other things that were in it, most frankly, but I think that these are the essential building blocks, not only for recovery, but important investments for our future. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Escher. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just going to take a different tack today. I think most of my colleagues would expect me to start fighting and screaming and kicking, but I come really before the committee as a whole to, to let folks know that my former legislative director of many years passed away last night. This morning, fought a courageous battle of cancer. Ray Fitzgerald. And many of you know him. I know the majority staff that were here. Ray is survived by Kristen, his wife, Wolgamuth. She worked here, I think, for John Porter and for the Labor Ed Committee. 3 young daughters, daughter Nora, 7, Maggie, 4, and Lucy, who's almost 2 years old. And Ray was very helpful on the energy debate, diesel technology, clean diesel, energy security. Of course, a lot of my positions were brought to me by Ray. He had a tremendous witness in the last months of his life. Many of the staffers here were on emails that kept us up to date on his battle. They are a strong Catholic family. Kristen supplied edification and strength to many as this battle was fought. And I just want to share that with the committee and all our friends and ask for prayers of support for Ray and his family. And when details are known, then we'll let folks know about that, and I thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shimkus. We would like to extend our condolences to his family, both personal and professional. We're sorry to hear this news. Chair would like to recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to ask unanimous consent to have my full statement placed in the record.
Without objection.
I want to thank you for exercising the committee's jurisdiction and holding a markup on the broadband, energy, and health care portions of the economic stimulus. I'll be brief, but I want to comment on each section we're marking up. I'm pleased to see the telecom portion includes the broadband mapping language we worked on in telecom subcommittee last Congress. I was a co-sponsor of that legislation. I believe it's important for us to have better information on broadband availability and speeds to help us make policy decisions to foster improved broadband development. I'm pleased language also creates a grant program to fund broadband deployment in underserved and unserved areas, but I do have concern about the speed and open access requirements placed on the funds. While the speed requirements are forward-looking, our main purpose for the bill is job creation, and I hope the Chair and leadership will reconsider the language, particularly open access requirements, and the disincentive it may create for some of the companies best suited to deploy broadband and create jobs. I support several of the provisions in the committee's print on energy, such as increasing support for smart grid projects and funding increasing weatherization and assistance and funding DOE loan programs. I also look forward to developing comprehensive energy legislation spearheaded by our committee in the months ahead. The bill does make investment in health care services and coverage in this country during tough times. And, Mr. Chairman, I'm almost done, or almost out of time, but I think the health care portion is probably one of the most important in the bill, and I'm glad it's included.
Thank you, Mr. Green. Gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Shadegg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you for holding this markup. It is important for us as policymakers in the nation to articulate our views on this critically important topic. We have different views, and I appreciate that there is an opportunity being provided by you to discuss those different views. This is a massive spending bill. It spends a stunning amount of money, which regrettably we don't have, which we'll have to borrow. I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this hearing and to offer amendments and to engage in discussion. I particularly appreciate that the President invited the minority to proffer their ideas on how we should stimulate the economy. There are different views. I could wish very much, Mr. Chairman, that there was more information that accompanied this legislation documenting the number of jobs each section is believed to create. But we don't have that information. I am deeply concerned that the CBO has said much of this money won't be spent for several years. Many of us believe we cannot borrow and spend our way out of this problem. I understand the need for urgency by the majority. They are, in fact, in charge. And All we can do is appreciate the fact that we get to debate these policies and then see how they work. I certainly hope for the benefit of the nation we are able to strengthen our economy and benefit all Americans.
Thank you, Mr. Shadegg. Gentlelady from Colorado, Mr. Gett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, as the economy worsens and people lose their jobs, they also lose their health care. And so the health care provisions of this legislation are going to be particularly important, not just to stimulate the economy, but also to ensure that people can have quality health care and for them and their kids. I want to thank, as we go through, the chairman for working with us on the chairman's mark to help us with funds for the Medicaid disproportionate share hospitals, because as people lose their jobs and health insurance, these hospitals become increasingly burdened, and many of our hospitals are already at the breaking point. This will help them be able to treat the underserved. I also want to thank the chairman and his staff for working with us on the broadband grants so that all the advanced technologies, including satellites, will be deployed in the expansion of this network. It will be important for all consumers, but most especially rural consumers. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll put the rest of my statement in the record.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gett. Gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Boyer. Pass. Okay. Then we have gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Pitts. Do you wish to make an opening statement? Gentleman's ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this markup. The problem with the plan that's being put forward is that, as I see it, it's not an economic stimulus. It's primarily a massive spending bill. According to the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, only 7%, or $26 billion out of the $274 billion of the planned spending on infrastructure projects would be delivered in the economy by fiscal year 2010. Just $1 in $7 of the massive $18.5 billion expenditure on energy efficiency and renewable energy programs will be spent within the next 18 months. Plans to bring broadband internet service to rural and underserved areas will take years to implement. Only 25% of clean drinking water projects can be completed by October of 2010. And I think in a time of serious economic hardship, the American people deserve a better economic stimulus. It should not be a special interest grab bag. They deserve a real economic recovery policy. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Pitts. Gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle passes. Then we would go to gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Schakowsky.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The latest figures from the Illinois Department of Employment Security show that unemployment in my state is at 7.3%, a 15-year high and higher than the national unemployment rate. Swift passage of this legislation will save and create jobs, support those harmed by the economic downturn, and lay the groundwork for a strong economy moving forward. We have a responsibility to act promptly and wisely. I want to highlight just a couple of provisions. First, this bill provides a 100% increase in weatherization funding to help make homes and businesses energy efficient, providing relief to those struggling to pay energy costs. Second, it provides a critical temporary boost in federal Medicaid assistance. With lower revenues and an increased number of uninsured residents, Illinois experienced a $1.5 billion shortfall last year. Third, we provide health coverage options for those losing both their jobs and their health care, access to COBRA benefits, giving states an option to expand Medicaid. And these fixes are critical, but also points out the need for comprehensive reform that guarantees health coverage regardless of economic conditions. And I hope we'll act quickly to enact this bill, get our economy back on track. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Schakowsky. Gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Walden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This legislation that's before us today, combined with what came out of Ways and Means, will cost $825 billion. That means for every job saved, quote unquote, it costs $222,297. The private sector in 2007, on average, created a job for about a fourth that amount, $50,000. The 11 appropriations out of the 152 in this bill to generate 1.8 million jobs cost a grand total of only $65 billion. So there's an enormous amount of money being thrown at this problem, and in fact, the government will have to go borrow $2 trillion in the coming weeks. The bond markets have never dealt with this kind of borrowing before. This is amazing to me. We each have about a minute to lay out our concerns on a bill that is going to dramatically change the course of this country and our children's future. The $2 trillion that's going to have to be borrowed in the coming weeks will be borrowed hopefully by foreign governments, and they then will send the bill back to our kids and grandkids. This is an abomination the way it's being done.
Thank you, Mr. Walden. Mr. Inslee?
Thank you. If I could ask the staff, I just want to point out something that's really, really smart in this bill, which is basically calling for the states to move forward on building code improvements to save energy and on provisions to allow utilities to sell efficiency besides electricity. And I want to refer the members to a graph that I hope they might become familiar with as we talk about energy in the next couple of years, and it's up on this chart over here. It's hard to read, but basically this is a graph provided by the McKinsey company looking at where you can save money, where you can make money by changing your energy policies. And if you look on the left side of the graph, everything below that line are things that save you money, that actually make money for the U.S. economy. They don't cost you a dollar, and they're all efficiency. They're more insulation, they're better windows, they're winterization, they're improvements in computer technology. And what we see is everything below that line saves the U.S. economy money in its efficiency. Now, there's some other things that may cost money in the short term over on the right side, some of the more expensive production systems, but that saves energy. And what this bill has done is directing the governors to assure us that if they're going to take $200 or $300 billion, they're going to agree to move forward on enhanced building codes and provisions to sell efficiency as well as electronics. Now, it's not as strong as some of us would have liked. We were going to look forward either now or later to a provision to condition the receipt of some of this money on actually achieving these actions, but it's a great first step for this committee to start moving this country to the left on that curve to saving consumers money on their energy bills by adopting efficiency provisions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Inslee. I'd like to now call on Mr. Terry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's kind of an interesting, bittersweet day. Finally, after years of talking about the need to have a comprehensive broadband policy in this country and kind of nibbling at the edges, we finally have it today. It was received in my office at 9:27 today, giving me no opportunity to look through this with I think significant questions like NTIA, is that actually the best? Do we agency to do this? There's already 2 or 3 other agencies that have expertise in this. Why aren't they involved? What is the definition of broadband here? What is unserved versus underserved? I've spent a lot of time looking on broadband issues over the last few years, and I've never seen the terms of basic broadband service versus advanced broadband service. What the heck are we talking about here? But yet billions of dollars are going to be based on someone in NTIA, I guess, defining those for us here today. We're spending dollars, significant dollars for this plan that's, I think, is necessary. But is it redundant to other agencies' efforts right now? Are we going to conflict? Are we going to double up? We talk about in here in one of the sections that to be eligible, you have to provide some information on how you're going to get computers out. Does this mean that for those underserved areas in an urban core where the issue isn't whether you're wired or not, it's whether you can afford a computer? Does the plan for the underserved areas require that you have to provide computers to households now? This is something that I think we're authorizing here with this language. We've had no hearings. This is just the wrong type of approach for something this massive. Do we need to have a foundation for the 21st century so we can be competitive, that everyone in our country has access to broadband? Absolutely, but delivering something to us at 9:27 and asking us to vote on it hours later is an atrocious way to accomplish that.
Thank you, Mr. Terry. Ms. Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for convening us today to consider this very important economic recovery and reinvestment bill. I applaud your leadership in the areas of healthcare, energy, and broadband technology. The bill is largely an excellent one, and I commend you and your staff for the very hard work that went into this, recognizing how serious and dire our economic situation is for our constituents and our nation. I'm going to touch quickly on the issue of health information technology, which is an area in which Wisconsin has been a leader, and I'll submit for the record a more detailed statement outlining the points that I want to raise. But I want to say first that early adopters of health information technology, it's important that we protect and make sure that they are not unduly penalized through our process. I know another focus is interoperability, and I hope that we incorporate the standards developed by the Certification Commission for Healthcare Information Technology. I would also encourage those federal standards to be a national bar, not allowing for a complex system of state regulations that providers will have to deal with. And lastly, I hope that we would like to ensure the bill's privacy provisions do not jeopardize public-private partnerships such as those in Wisconsin and throughout the country, which use de-identified data to help improve health care quality and efficiency. With that, again, thank you for your work, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Ms. Baldwin. The Chair would now recognize Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Americans are suffering through a painful recession, so there's certainly no question about the need for stimulus. In fact, yesterday in Michigan, our unemployment rate reached a new high of 10.6%. So nobody than us Michiganders understand the need for stimulus. Unfortunately, when you look at this, there is not much stimulus in it. There are some laudable things in here on energy. But because we've had no hearings, it's pretty hard for us to even tell the majority that there's a provision in here. If you save energy, it allows energy companies to charge consumers more for saving energy. So they save energy, their energy bill or their monthly bills go up. That's in this bill. That's not a good idea. And if we'd had the opportunity to allow people to petition their government, like it says in the First Amendment, it's not about us being able to talk. It's about people who will be impacted by this bill. They ought to have the right to come to this table and say, hey, wait a minute. According to the First Amendment, I have the right to tell you, Congress, what my concerns are about this bill. We have taken away America's right to petition their government by having no hearings and spending, what, if it all goes through, $2 trillion. $2 trillion in the next few months. Matter of fact, on broadband, people who have been involved in expanding broadband in this bill will not be eligible for the money. So if you've been doing it all along and investing that money and trying to bring technology to every corner of the United States, you are ineligible for receiving broadband money. It would have been great to have a hearing to allow people to petition their government to say, hey, wait a minute, did you think about how this might impact us? Japan has said that they will stop buying U.S. debt. They're one of our largest debt holders. Imagine what this bill might do to the value of the dollar. I sure would like to have some folks who may be impacted by this, as in every consumer in America, have the right to come to this table and petition their government and say, hey, wait a minute, did you think about what would happen if in the next 2 weeks you add $2 trillion of debt to the bond market? What will happen to the value of the dollar? What will happen to people who are buying our debt? Will people continue to buy it? Will they unload their debt? We have some serious challenges in here that may do more harm than good. And I would hope, Mr. Chairman, that we don't make a habit of saying that we're going to disregard Americans' right to the First Amendment to petition their government and raise very serious issues about what can happen if we do this quickly. And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers. Mr. Butterfield.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I too, Mr. Chairman, want to thank you for convening this markup today. It's certainly timely. I represent the 15th poorest district in the United States of America. My people are hurting. I represent a rural district in eastern North Carolina, and things are not so good right now. The poor are getting poorer. Many in the middle class are being pushed into poverty. Cities and towns and counties need a lifeline, to be sure. One of my counties, I have a 13% unemployment rate. One of my major towns has a 10% unemployment rate. We need a lifeline now. We need investment, we need recovery, and I don't see any other way to do it, Mr. Chairman. I support this legislation. I urge a vigorous debate today and passage later this evening. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Sullivan.
Thank you, Chairman Waxman. I appreciate your calling this meeting today to mark up the portions of the American Recovery and Investment Bill of 2009 that are in the jurisdiction of the House Energy and Commerce Committee. Chairman Waxman, before I begin, I want to congratulate you on your election to chairmanship of the Energy and Commerce Committee. I look forward to working with you on issues of importance to the nation and to my constituents in the 1st Congressional District of Oklahoma. As a member of this committee, I consider this markup to be important in an effort to stimulate our troubled economy. The scope of the bill before us is wide in that it touches energy, health care, and telecommunications policies, which are vital towards ensuring the economic growth of this nation. However, I wish I had more time to address the legislation through normal committee process so that all members of the committee had the time to look at the merits of the underlying bill and ask substantial and hard questions on whether or not the bill before us today would actually provide stimulus to our economy. I'm concerned with many of the aspects of the health care portion of the bill regarding the cost and scope of Medicaid provisions, as well as the inclusion of Davis-Bacon prevailing wage requirements in Section 5003 of the energy portion of the bill, providing loan guarantees for commercial renewable energy systems and electric power transmission systems. Davis-Bacon is a Depression-era wage subsidy law enacted in 1931, which, according to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, is known to inflate the cost of federally funded construction projects by as much as 15%, costing taxpayers over $1 billion annually. If we are looking to save taxpayer dollars in this process, which I think we should be, striking Davis-Bacon wage requirements in this bill would be a good place to start. I look forward to considering the many amendments that will be offered today in the effort to improve this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much. Mr. Barrow.
I thank the chair, but in the interest of time, I'll waive an opening. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had a prepared statement, but it's not here right now. But I would like to...
we'll hold the record open.
No, that's all right.
Okay.
I think what I want to say here, Mr. Chairman, is there's going to be a lot of amendments that are going to be offered here today that are good amendments. For example, Mr. Shimkus is going to be offering an amendment, as I understand it, on carbon sequestration. I will vote against all of these amendments, including that one, even though I think Mr. Shimkus' idea is a good one. I just don't think it's a good one on this particular bill. I think the President has put forward a good faith effort to try to pass a stimulus bill that is desperately needed by the American people. And so in his interest, in the interest of unanimity, I'm going to be voting to kick out this stimulus package today, which I think is a part of the process that we need to go through, reserving judgment on final passage on the House floor. But I did want to make some of my Republican friends on the Republican side of the aisle that a lot of the ideas that they're proposing today are good ideas. They may just not be a good idea on this particular bill. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hill. Ms. Metsu, let's see, we would go to the Mr. Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe we're here to address an economic recovery package to stimulate our stumbling economy. But the best economic recovery is a job. This bill is a long way to go if it is to create jobs now when they are needed the most by 11 million Americans looking for work, paying their bills, and worrying about their family's retirement. We could use this to create a lot of jobs. We could have invested in critical research and development of clean coal power. The construction of each power plant would employ thousands of boilermakers, carpenters, electricians, laborers, etc. But it doesn't do this. Instead, we will do some important work on a smart grid. That's good. But a smart grid without new generation only gives us the means to provide more efficient rolling brownouts. Our small towns and large cities badly need hundreds of billions right now to fix their infrastructure of water and sewer and road projects. Instead, we're sending hundreds of billions to expand government programs. This bill will provide important funds for health, IT, electronic medical records, and that's good. It's going to save billions in unnecessary and redundant medical procedures, an issue I've been fighting for years, but we must insist the jobs to provide the software development are U.S. jobs, not offshore jobs. Later, I'm going to offer an amendment to guarantee the American taxes pay for American jobs and health IT, and I hope my colleagues support the amendment. Quite frankly, we ought to do the same for construction. Overall, as we proceed in this, I hope we remember the best economic recovery package is a job. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy. Ms. Matsui.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank you for calling today's markup. The business of the committee today is urgent. It's no secret that our economy is in serious trouble. I've talked and listened to many of my constituents in Sacramento who are struggling to make ends meet. They are facing layoffs, furloughs, foreclosure, unpaid medical bills, and a lack of support to help them in this crucial time. That is why I'm eager to work with you and with all of my colleagues on this committee to develop a robust economic recovery package. Our economy needs help, and so do the people who make our economy run every single day. America needs to recover, and with this bill as a starting point, it will recover. I thank you very much for your leadership on this issue, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Matsui. Mr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's already been an interesting start to what's going to be a terribly interesting day, and I certainly appreciate the comments of my colleagues on both sides. We've heard the word urgent used many times this morning. We heard the phrase, this is as urgent as it comes. I would just remind my colleagues in surgery, we used to have a saying, please go slowly, after all, we're in a hurry. We also heard the call for bold action, and I support bold action. I would also just remind us that health care is not always about insurance companies, and it's not always about more government programs. Healthcare insurance, a federal program, doesn't do you a lot of good if you don't have a provider, a physician, to see when you get ill. Now, we do face serious shortages in our healthcare workforce. We've talked about that before in this committee in the previous Congress, and I hope we can spend some time discussing that today, and several of the amendments that I will bring forward today will deal with that. We all know the reasons. There's the barriers to entry, there's the cost, there's the lack of slots in residencies and primary care, but the most pernicious is the sustainable growth rate formula that knocks down physician reimbursement year over year in the Medicare formula, and until we deal with that problem, we are not going to build our physician workforce that we need. So, time for bold action. I submit that there are several things we can do to the sustainable growth rate formula to make it go away, or at least make it less pernicious, and we ought to take that action today, and I'll yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Burgess. Ms. Christensen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you also for holding this markup to help to consider and help shape the final economic recovery package. It's an important bill, it's a good bill, and I look forward to moving it quickly to the President's desk as he has asked. But as we address all of the issues under our jurisdiction, and importantly in health care, it is important that we include provisions that would help to eliminate the health disparities that exist along racial, ethnic, gender, and geographic lines, particularly in the provisions on comparative effectiveness and HIT. In my opinion, failing to do so would thwart the purpose of this bill and the mission of this committee to ensure that all who live in this country have equal access to quality health care and equally benefit from the improvements that we're about to implement. Finally, I note that under broadband and HIT, and I may have missed it in some of the other sections, state is clearly defined to include the District of Columbia and the territories, and I hope that this definition is applicable throughout the bill. With that, I would submit my entire statement for the record. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Ms. Christensen. Ms. Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I think that all of us agree that issues such as broadband expansion, access to affordable health care, the implementation of health IT are items that we want to see accomplished. What is of tremendous concern is the manner in which we are moving forward today. I have found it so interesting to hear we have to hurry up, we have to hurry up, we have to do something. We have already had Plan A presented in economic stimulus. We know that has left us with a $1.2 trillion debt. There are websites like the Bloomberg site, didthebailoutwork.com, that will list every bit of the federal resources from all the different agencies that have gone in to economic recovery over the past year, and you're looking at $3.2 trillion. So, Mr. Chairman, I would submit that we know Plan A didn't work. We know Plan B has a lot of problems. You're talking about another $825 billion. What happens if we need a plan C? We are using up our available capital without a well thought out plan by picking winners and losers, by moving forward in haste. The American people know you cannot spend your way to economic recovery, and they are looking for something different. And I would encourage that we take our time and that we do this in the appropriate manner, and we do it without burdening our children and our precious grandchildren and leaving them with a debt that cannot be dealt with either in the short term or the long term. And I yield back.
Thank you very much, Ms. Blackburn. Ms. Castor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your swift action, because Americans everywhere are feeling the impact of this economic crisis. More Americans are looking for work, can't afford their medical care, millions have lost their homes, and economists fear that the problem is getting worse, not better. My home state of Florida has been particularly hard hit. This committee today will answer the call of our new president to pick ourselves up, dust ourselves off, and begin again the work of remaking America. We will do this by passing an economic recovery plan that is targeted and strategic. We will make a fundamental new commitment to our citizens, their health and energy security and independence. We will provide billions of dollars to states that have been slashing their budgets, hurting the economic interests of their citizens, especially in education and health care. We are going to make a down payment on the coming health care reform and modernization. We will ensure that the health care promises made to American families are kept and that the unemployed do not suffer a greater hardship. I look forward to swift action by this committee and President Obama to help put America back on the right track. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Ms. Castor. Mr. Stearns.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And obviously on this side we're not happy with the rush to judgment here. But I do want to compliment you on for trying to extend our jurisdiction and make sure that a bill of this magnitude that the majority is putting forth, that you're saying the Energy and Commerce has a say-so. And I think that's something I want to encourage you as we go through this process and expediting bills, that we make sure Energy and Commerce has a fair say. The provisions in the House bill designed to spur broadband deployment are not likely, in my opinion, to be effective, and will require the FCC to rush to judgment on some of the most complicated and consequential issues facing the communications industry today. Broadband, as we know, has the potential to transform our economy, and I applaud the focus on this type of transformational infrastructure. Unfortunately, the open access provisions in this stimulus bill will prevent us from achieving the full stimulative potential of these upgrades. Amazingly, the bill does not even define open access, but instead would simply require the FCC to set the definition within 45 days of enactment, and would allow for the open access requirement to apply not just to the infrastructure supported by the grant, but also to the entity's entire broadband network. Finally, Mr. Chairman, we're investing billions of dollars in technologies. I note there's nothing to do with nuclear power. In Florida, particularly my congressional district, we are planning construction of 2 new nuclear power plants. Now, these power plants will generate over 3,000 new jobs at the peak of construction, while cutting the output of greenhouse gases. So I think that's something that unfortunately is not in the bill that I would support. But again, I would applaud your efforts here to extend our jurisdiction and make sure we have a say-so. I just regret that we didn't have more time to look at the bill. With that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sarbanes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Apologize for my voice today. I'm still recovering from the other day. This is an important markup. We rarely get the opportunity to get a twofer or a threefer, but with the Economic Recovery and Reinvestment Act and our portions of it, we're accomplishing a number of things that are important. First, we are stimulating the economy. Secondly, we're beginning to make investments that we should be making anyhow. That's the twofer. The threefer is, I think we're going to, in this bill, begin to model some things that make sense in terms of long-term reform. And in particular, I note the extension of COBRA coverage, making COBRA coverage available to people that would otherwise not get it, and providing other means of establishing some continuity of care and coverage. Those are all things that are important as we consider the larger health care reform debate. So we're going to learn something from this short-term exercise that we're engaged in that's going to be beneficial to us in some of the long-term reform that we want to see. And so this is an important markup. I look forward to hearing the comments from both the Republicans and Democrats on the committee as we proceed today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Blunt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I understand that you had to work hard, Mr. Chairman, to be sure our committee would have a look at this bill, and I'm grateful to you for doing this, and hopefully we'll have a chance to offer some constructive changes today. The bill in front of us is the largest single spending package in the history of the country. This bill has an estimated cost of $850 billion. By comparison, all of the programs of the New Deal combined cost about $500 billion in today's dollars, and at that time unemployment was around 25%. This debate would probably be different today if, in fact, most of us believed that we could defend the idea that it was truly stimulative. The Congressional Budget Office has told us that only 7% of the overall bill will be spent within the next year, and no more than half can be spent within the next 2 years. Really, a real question here for a stimulus bill is how is that stimulative? Since this legislation is moving so quickly, members of the Congress have not had time to really look at it. We don't have a solid estimate of cost, but apparently about $150 billion of this package is before our committee. Mr. Chairman, I submit the rest of my statement for the record and look forward to the discussion today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Blunt. Ms. Harman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Two brief comments. First, on broadband, I support increased funding for the DTV converter box coupon program, but remind the committee that the real reason for the DTV transition is to free up and build out analog spectrum for emergency communications. As you know, that task remains incomplete. Second, on health care, I have called you the dish maven, and I'm very pleased to hear that in a manager's amendment, you are going to raise the cap to permit hospitals like Harbor UCLA, located very close to LAX and the Port of Los Angeles, two major terror targets, to get additional funding so their level 1 trauma centers can be kept open. Without this funding, big city hospitals will be on life support, and in a time of high unemployment, this would be a very terrible outcome. So I want to commend you personally for the effort you're making to make DISH available for big cities all over the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Harman. Mr. Radonovich.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to echo the thoughts of many of the members on this committee on my appreciation of the fact that this bill is before this committee for markup. I also want to echo some thoughts and that we've already spent $1 trillion dealing with the sour economy that we have right now. We're about to spend close to another $1 trillion on it. Our deficit this year is projected to be larger than what I've been told the entire budget of the year 2000. And I'm real concerned about the fact that government tends to overreact to problems, spending a lot more than what we need to do in order to give people the impression that we're going to be out of these difficult times sooner than we are. And I can't let this markup go by without expressing a grave concern that we're bankrupting this country. There's going to be some time of day where we're going to flat out run out of cash. And the era of big government is going to go bankrupt. And we've got to begin to look for other ways and other things to solve our problems in this country without thinking that we can pass a law and spend money and make it all work. So I just want to leave that thought with the committee, but I do appreciate the fact that we're marking up and the ability to give the opening comments. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Radonovich. Mr. Gonzalez, do you wish to make an opening statement? Waive opening statement. Mr. Melanson, do you wish to be recognized? Mr. Melanson waives. Mr. Space.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank you and your staff for working with my staff in drafting a piece of legislation that will be beneficial for the people of Ohio and the people of Ohio's 18th District. This legislation will help expand access to broadband internet, a vital piece of infrastructure in today's economy in rural America, where it's badly needed. And it has ancillary benefits extending into health care and education, which are significant and difficult to measure. I'm also pleased with the changes to the weatherization program, which will bring access to aid for thousands of low-income homeowners in my district, seeking to make their homes more efficient with products like attic insulation. And finally, I'm excited to see legislation that will guarantee that states like mine facing extreme budget shortfalls will have the resources they need to continue to offer health services through the Medicaid program. In these difficult times, this Congress must act to address the needs of those struggling to make ends meet. And we have before us today legislation that will promote this goal and to improve the quality of life for the people of Ohio and this country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Space. Ms. Bono-Mack?
I'll waive. Thank you.
Ms. Myrick?
No, I just also want to thank you for doing this today.
Thank you very much. Mr. Gingrey.
Chairman Waxman, I want to thank you for insisting on this markup in energy and commerce, but I do have some reservations about exactly what we're doing and how quickly we're doing it. I first raised some concerns in our initial hearing of the 111th Congress about the process whereby the committee was holding a hearing on a report which had only been released for a little over an hour, and that was the recommendation by a U.S. cap panel to move with all due haste to a cap-and-trade regime. Now, at this committee's first markup, I once again have serious reservations not only about this process, but also about the legislative substance that this process will enable to move quickly through this committee, through this Congress, and all the way to the President's desk under the auspices of an emergency stimulus package. We have heard time and again that the economy needs an immediate shot in the arm by infusing $500 billion in taxpayer money in ready-to-go projects and infrastructure. Well, when I look over the details of this bill and the sections this committee has under consideration, Mr. Chairman, I see billions and billions of taxpayer dollars being spent not now but years from now, not in the immediate term. And I also see a lot of permanent changes to law that likely will only be curiously vetted and then promptly rubber-stamped. I'll end my statement with a question to my colleagues on the other side. I know each of you, to some degree, worked very hard to get into the majority by hammering the last Republican Congress as a rubber-stamp Congress. I would caution against letting the same be true of you. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Mr. McNerney, opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, we've heard from many of our colleagues on both sides of the aisle this morning about how urgently help is needed. Well, this package is a step toward meeting that need. But in order to get there, we have to put aside the false choices, such as the false choice between jobs on the one hand and clean energy and efficiency on the other hand. We have a real opportunity here to kickstart our economy and transform ourselves into a new future, a new sustainable future. Americans are demanding that we here in Washington get things done. This package does that. It deserves our support. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Scalise.
Thank you, Chairman Waxman and Ranking Member Barton. It's an honor to serve on the House Energy and Commerce Committee. I look forward to debating the energy, health care, and broadband components of this bill, as well as the amendments brought forward by my colleagues. As our country is facing tough economic times, we would be well served to look across the country to see how others are handling things. Families are tightening their belts to live within their means. States are tightening their belts to balance their budgets. It seems Washington, D.C. is the only place going on a wild spending spree to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars. According to the Congressional Budget Office, roughly half of the spending will occur in the next 2 years, which means that less than half of this bill is going to actually be used to inject our economy, so you really can't call it stimulus. Really, it looks like more of a grab bag for new spending. Rather than going on a massive spending spree, we would be better served by cutting taxes for middle-class families and small businesses so that they can create jobs, not government creating more jobs in the government sector. I would suggest there are better alternatives to this spending bill, such as H.R. 470, the Economic Recovery and Middle-Class Tax Relief Act of 2009, which rather than add almost $1 trillion of new debt to what is already a massive debt, it actually goes and cuts taxes for those families and small businesses that can do much better with that money than this bill will be doing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Mr. Rush.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for convening this important markup. Today we will take important steps to change course, confront our economic crises, and correct policies that have not amounted to, quote, real and meaningful relief for hardworking families. Across this country, Mr. Chairman, our communities have been hung up. Now we are prepared to give them a hand up. Our focus on expanding access to broadband, moving forward on energy independence, and enhancing health care services to unemployed and uninsured, these changes are examples of change that we can believe in. Mr. Chairman, I have been a long advocate to bridge the digital divide and expand high-speed data services in underserved urban and unserved rural communities. This bill is a good first step in spurring the build-out and delivery of broadband services to communities that have been ignored by the private market. I also support expanding eligibility to families who are in desperate need of the weatherization assistance program. By raising the eligible dollars from $2,500 to $5,000 per household, nearly 45 million families would not have to choose between heating their homes or feeding their families. Lastly, I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership on the rollout of health information technology, health care coverage for the unemployed, and increased Medicaid dollars to our states and hospitals. I am particularly pleased to see additional funding for the DISH hospitals that was included in the package. And Mr. Chairman, although I would like to have seen provisions to expand the 340B program included in this package, I appreciate you and your staff working with me to make expansion of the 340B program a reality in the 111th Congress. Again, I thank you for your hard work on this economic recovery package, and I look forward to collaborating with you in the future.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rush. Ms. Sutton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very pleased that this Congress and the new administration are moving forward with this economic recovery legislation that is aimed squarely at restoring the promise of the middle class. For too long, working families have been struggling to pay bills, maintain health coverage, and keep their jobs. In Ohio, we're struggling with an unemployment rate of 7.3%. Cities are struggling to provide essential services and the need to improve critical infrastructure and to create new jobs and opportunities. So I'm very grateful that our committee is moving quickly to address the urgent needs of those who have been hurt the most by the economic downturn. This bill provides key provisions for working Americans to create much-needed jobs, provisions that call for an increase of FMAP and additional funds to expand state Medicaid programs, and the broadband and energy provisions in this bill are likewise vital to America's future. The energy provisions will increase renewable energy production and also enable families to make energy-saving investments in their homes through the Weatherization Assistance Program. Constituents throughout my district from Lorain to Akron are concerned about keeping their jobs, their health care, and their homes, and this legislation will begin to address those concerns. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Sutton. Mr. Braley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your willingness to work with me and Congresswoman Baldwin to improve the Department of Energy's loan guarantee program. This program can have a tremendously positive impact on America's shift to renewable energy, and I'm glad to see the provisions in the bill today to improve and fully implement the program. As many of you probably know, some traditional ethanol facilities have fallen on hard times, just like industries in other sectors of our economy. Facilities that want to invest in leading-edge technologies are having trouble getting loans they would typically get from places like Wall Street because of decreased lending from many financial institutions. The chairman has worked with Congresswoman Baldwin and I to add greater eligibility to the program, to open it up to investments in leading-edge biofuel projects, by providing financing for facilities that have developed technologies proven at the pilot or demonstration level and are likely to become commercial technologies. By providing this financing, we will help ensure that ethanol facilities and biofuels producers can weather the recession by modernizing their technologies. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Braley. Mr. Welch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Two things. First, it's very important, and I think all committee members, Republicans and Democrats, appreciate your insistence on having the Energy and Commerce Committee review the stimulus. We need a stimulus. There's an emergency that requires emergency action. Much of the work had to be done before we even arrived here, but that emergency does not mean that this committee should not have its opportunity to review this and hear from both Republicans and Democrats about the best composition of this plan. Second, and more importantly, it's essential that we use the opportunity of creating a new energy policy as a means of creating a new economy. If we're going to stem the loss of jobs and begin creating jobs in this country rather than exporting them, an engine for that new economic revival will be a green energy policy. And that is one of the most urgent tasks that this Congress faces. One of my colleagues on the other side said the best program is a good job, and he's right. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Welch. If all members who wish to make an opening statement if all members have done so, we'll now proceed to the first print before us, and the chair would call up the committee print concerning broadband initiatives. And without objection, the committee print will be considered as read. The clerk will designate Section 1.
General Provisions. This subtitle, Section 3101, Inventory of Broadband Service, Capability and Availability.
Chair recognizes himself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute. Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to the committee print dated January 19, 2009.
Without objection, this amendment will be considered as read. The amendment in the nature of a substitute the broadband package before us today would distribute $2.825 billion for wireless and wireline broadband through a grant program administered by the National Telecommunications Information Administration, NTIA. Approximately $1 billion would go to the deployment of wireless service. The language establishes a goal that 25% of this amount will go to unserved areas and 75% to underserved areas. In addition, $1.8 billion will go to the deployment of broadband via fiber or other wires, again with a goal of 25% to basic broadband in unserved areas and 75% to advanced broadband underserved areas. The proposal aims to be technologically neutral, allowing participation by any eligible entity, including service providers, infrastructure companies, or a state or unit of local government. Eligible entities are required to abide by minimum speed requirements as well as other important policy goals. States will play a key role in this program. And finally, in addition to minimum speed requirements, grant applicants at NTIA must also address other policy-related considerations, including the impact of service on public safety, healthcare delivery, education, and computer literacy. The substitute differs from the committee print that was distributed late last week in two primary ways. First, the substitute adds language to ensure greater transparency and accountability by requiring NTIA to issue an annual report assessing the impact and effectiveness of the grants. Second, the substitute makes clear that as many entities as possible are eligible to apply for a grant, including satellite companies. And I urge members to support this amendment. The chair will now call for amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute. Mr. Stearns.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
This is the amendment dealing with the $250 million
Chairman.
fix.
Mr. Chairman,
Gentlelady,
reserving a point of order.
a point of order is reserved by the gentlelady from Colorado.
Chairman, we're waiting for copies.
I think the amendment's coming as we speak.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Mr. Chairman, just dispense with the reading.
Offered by Mr. Strunk.
Go ahead and read it so we can just verify the...
Strike all after the enacted clause and insert the following. Section 1, additional coupons. A, amendment.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I intend to withdraw this amendment, and this is really something that was going to be discussed more fully in the markup on the DTV transition markup that you had scheduled, and you had postponed. Obviously, your staff spent many, many hours perhaps preparing for that markup that we were supposed to have yesterday, and obviously our staff did the same thing, and we'd worked out amendments. We were sort of a little bit schizophrenic about it because you postponed it. We were ready. On the other hand, we're glad that you delayed that because we didn't agree with you, and this amendment is basically authorizing $250 million for the coupon program, allowing the NTIA to use first-class mail to get coupons to consumers faster, and extending the FCC's authority to auction spectrum another year to 2012. The coupon program is not out of money, and we'd like to convince you that this is true, then a simple fix can be had here. Only half of the $1.5 billion in the coupon program has been spent on redeemed coupons. The other half remains in circulation, which is why there is a waiting list. The coupons expire 90 days after issued, if not used, and about 300,000 coupons expire every week, and the recovered funding is used to send more coupons. So, my colleagues, this amendment would enable the NTIA to immediately resume distributing additional coupons off the waiting list even before active coupons expire. This amendment is based on a suggestion by the Commerce Secretary. I have here a letter that he sent on January 14th to Ranking Member Barton. A similar letter was sent to you, Mr. Chairman, among others, you'll recall. And much of the $250 million authorized could come back from expired coupons at the end of the program. So simply extending the FCC's auction authority would also raise additional money that would offset some of the cost. So we feel that in light of your postponement of the markup yesterday, that you'll take full consideration of the dialogue that I have today, and perhaps you might want to comment on this amendment before I withdraw it, realizing that, as the Department of Secretary said in his January 14th letter, we can solve this without a delay. Providing this $250 million fix immediately would solve the problem, and then all the additional cost and expense that the companies who advertised, who provided announcements, and leased out equipment to start the installation, as well as the maintenance people to make this transition, is all in place, and with a simple $250 million of authorization of funds, as pointed out by the Secretary of Commerce's letter, we would solve the problem, and obviously we would not have to go to a markup, which would make your time much more useful, and you would not need to continuance of that markup. And so with the balance of time, I'd be glad to have a colloquy with you to perhaps maybe you would consider this amendment in light of the fact I'm going to withdraw it, but as a possibility of solving the problem.
If the gentleman would yield to me, I thank you for offering this amendment. I certainly want to give it full consideration and talk to you and other members further about what we need to do and what we'll be able to do to deal with the looming problem of the deadline for a transition for the television set. So I'll be pleased to continue to work with you on it.
And I thank Mr. Chairman. With that, unless anyone else wishes to speak on this, I would ask unanimous consent to withdraw the amendment.
Without objection, the amendment's withdrawn. Further amendments to the legislation? Mr. Stupak.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk. It's Amendment 001. Starts off in Section 3102.
Yes, clerk will report the amendment.
Sorry. Amendment offered by Mr. Stupak of Michigan. In Section 3102F2B.
Without objection,
Chairman,
the amendment,
the
amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief. The economic recovery legislation before us today requires that the NTIA coordinate with the FCC in the distribution of this grant funding. The legislation mentions weighing decisions toward emergency response use, but does not mention interoperable communication specifically. The purpose of my amendment is to clarify that this grant money is also available for the construction of interoperable wireless broadband communications. Currently pending at the FCC is a national license of spectrum for wireless broadband known as the D block. The intention of the D block is to provide spectrum to build an interoperable wireless national broadband network. Both former Chairman Kevin Martin and the Democratic commissioners last year have stated to this committee that federal assistance will be helpful in moving forward on their attempt to re-auction the spectrum. By adding my amendment language, we can provide clear authority to the FCC and NTIA to provide some of this grant funding towards the building of an interoperable wireless broadband network for emergency response. I urge members of the committee to support this amendment. I yield back.
Gentlemen, yield to me. I want to indicate my support for the amendment. I haven't heard of any opposition to it, and I would urge members to adopt it. Let me, by the way, ask unanimous consent that your amendment and all amendments that are drafted to the committee print regarding broadband are made in order to the amendment in the nature of a substitute, which is now considered the underlying bill for purposes of amendment. Without objection, that will be the order. Any further discussion of the Stupak amendment? Ms. Harman.
Yes, I intend to support the amendment and think, as I said in my opening remarks, that an interoperable communications network nationally is something we need to achieve urgently. That, after all, was the point of the DTV transition. And so I think Mr. Stupak is right to try to expedite funds to communities. The only caution I would raise, and I have a feeling Mr. Stupak agrees with me, is we don't want each community to build operable communications for that community and then and miss the opportunity to have interoperable communications nationally. So I support this amendment, but I hope that we will, when it is adopted, include report language, that our goal still remains to have a national interoperable emergency communications capability. And I yield to Mr. Stupak if in any way my view is inconsistent with his view.
No, your view is consistent. We want to just clarify that we can use this funding for interoperability. We checked with the appropriators to make sure we're not being duplicative in our efforts, that as they're marking up and we are not, and they were supportive of the clarification language.
Thank you, Ms. Harman. Any further discussion of the Stupak amendment? If not, are we ready for the question? All those in favor of the Stupak amendment will say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment's agreed to. Chair now calls for further amendments to the bill before us. Mr. Blunt.
Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
The clerk will report the amendment, and the gentlelady from Colorado reserves a point of order on the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Blunt. After subsection G, insert the following new subsection and redesignate subsection subsequent subsections accordingly.
Mr. Chairman, I ask that the amendment be considered as read.
Without objection, that will be the order.
Mr. Chairman, this amendment deals with the whole issue of underserved and unserved, whether it deals with wireless voice service, basic broadband service, advanced broadband, advanced wireless broadband, advanced broadband services, and in each of those categories, the amendment just simply says that you would provide grants to unserved areas would have a priority over grants to underserved areas. When you're talking about federal money, I'm sure everyone the contention that an area could be better served is probably universal. And so everyone is going to compete for that underserved area of money granted. What this amendment really does is just simply focusing on unserved areas. I assume that those areas are principally rural but not exclusively rural. If you have an unserved area, the grant money has to be focused on that area before it can go to provide multiple service in other areas of the country. It's straightforward. I would like to see it put into the bill, and I offer it for discussion and then for a vote, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, I withdraw my reservation.
The gentlelady withdraws her point of order. Discussion of the amendment.
Mr. Chairman.
Who is seeking?
Mr. Chairman, over here on your left, which
well,
is
we'll go to the Democratic side first, and then we'll go back.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. This is a rural-first amendment, and I do appreciate the sentiment. And if this NTIA grant program for broadband, wireline, and wireless deployment was the only such grant program in the recovery package, I would be much more sympathetic to adopting it. But we have to keep in mind, as we deliberate here in the Commerce Committee, that there is yet another $3 billion for grants in the broader stimulus package for rural areas through the Rural Utilities Service, which is coming through the Agriculture Committee. In other words, there is another $3 billion already targeted for rural priorities through that program. Now, we can debate whether the Rural Utility Service should have that job or not, whether the Agriculture Committee should have that job or not, or whether it would have been better to put all of the money, all nearly $6 billion, at the NTIA. But it is the reality. And we need to take legislative note of the fact that rural areas have another $3 billion for broadband elsewhere in the recovery package. I also don't believe an underserved, disadvantaged urban or suburban area in dire need of economic development or revitalization should have to wait for assistance until all rural unserved areas are reached. We have real economic development opportunities in other parts of the country in addition to rural, but just understand that this nearly $6 billion package includes that $3 billion that goes to rural America, plus the additional rural money that's in this package as well. And I think, having taken note of that, the package as it comes before our committee represents the fair balance that exists in the totality of the stimulus package, and I urge a no vote on this amendment, with every member having a clear conscience, knowing that the bulk of the package does go to rural America in its entirety. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Mr. Walden.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I guess if we'd had a hearing, I might be able to ask someone else this question, but I guess I'll have to direct it to our counsel if that's okay. On page 3 of the underlying legislation, it refers to unserved and underserved, and I wonder where we have a definition of those two terms, first of all. I mean, I think I understand what unserved is. I'm not sure I understand what underserved means. Is that they only have one carrier, two carriers?
Congressman, the bill directs the FCC to define those terms.
So we punt to the FCC to determine whether an area is unserved or underserved. Is it currently undefined by the FCC? So this is a new term we're going to put in statute. Now then, having said that, I note that there are
situations later on in the underlying grant program where we are supposed to make a determination that 75% of the money goes to the underserved and 25% maximum goes to the unserved. Is there a reason? Do you know how that number was picked, that ratio? Because I've heard we're going to do rural broadband build-out in this bill.
Congressman, all I can tell you is that the bill directs the NTIA administrator to seek to distribute no more than 75% to underserved and 25% to unserved.
So only a quarter of the money goes to those areas that have no service today, and that's a definition we understand, but 75% will go to areas that may already have some service, but we don't know how that will be defined until NTIA or the FCC defines underserved, correct?
Yes, the bill directs the FCC.
Then let me go to line 23 of the underlying bill, section, I may be wrong here, but it starts with the number 2 and called limitations. And I will read it for you because I believe there's an error in the drafting, and perhaps you can explain it if it's not. It says 2, limitation, the unserved and underserved areas identified by a state in the report required by this subsection shall not represent in the aggregate more than 20% of the population or of the geographic area of such state. Now, does that mean that the money, that there's a 20% geographic limitation here as well as population?
It refers to the report that the priorities report that a state may submit identifying areas within that state to which it would like grant monies directed.
And so if a state had, say, 30% of its geography with no service, as I read this language, they would still fall under a further limitation that no more than 20% of that state would qualify for funds, of that geographic area of that state, correct? So one trumps the other, right?
That's correct, except that the bill doesn't put a cap on 25%. It is endeavor to, or shall seek to limit, it is not a hard cap.
On the 20%?
On the 25% of the grant funds to be distributed.
Right, we are talking about the 25-75, but I'm also talking about the 20% geography here. But what this says is the unserved and underserved areas of a state cannot be more than 20% of the geography of that state.
No, the recommendation that the state makes to the NTIA can...
So why was 20% picked?
Well, sir, all I can say is that's what the bill says right now.
So I'll direct that to the chairman then, since I don't want to pick on you onto the policy side. Mr. Chairman, can you tell me why 20% was picked in your bill? I would yield to the chairman.
You could yield to me. Well, the numbers were to reflect the fact that we didn't want all the money to go to one area, but to serve both the unserved and the underserved areas. And perhaps Mr. Markup can give you a further explanation.
I'm curious about the 75-25 split and the 20%, because these are numbers that just appear all of a sudden and will be in statute soon.
Let me again restate, just so you can, we'll keep this in this debate, and let's keep it in front of us. All of the money that is coming out of the Agriculture Committee is going to the rural parts of America. That's $3 billion, just so you understand. We have another approximately $3 billion here as well. Okay, just so you understand that.
I understand.
What we have here in the 75%, 25% are aspirational goals. Okay, just so, again, you understand. These are not, it's not hard. It's an aspirational goal that we place here, but understanding the $3 billion right off the top goes to rural America.
Well, let me reclaiming my time because it's about out. I'm not sure it says that when it says the NTIA shall seek to distribute grants. So it shall seek under this subsection word of the eligibility service. So 75-25 really doesn't mean anything. Then it's just guidance to the agency.
That's correct. It's aspirational, and we're trying to express.
Well, the reason I raise the issue on geography is that, for example, my district's probably 2/3 of the landmass of the state of Oregon and probably represents the most underserved areas in the state of Oregon. And I'm trying to figure out why we would then tell the state you can only have 20% of the geography of the state of Oregon classify under unserved or underserved. And I'm out of time.
The gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Stupak is seeking recognition.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I won't get into the 75-25 or 80-20. I agree with Mr. Blunt. I'd like all the money to go to rural areas. And like you, Mr. Walden, my district's very underserved. But these are definitions we've kicked around in this committee for a few years. We've had a number of hearings on what is unserved and underserved. And if you take a look at the latest Farm Bureau and the Rural Utility Services, we tried to tighten up that language. What is unserved and underserved, and we've had those definitions going on. I actually have a second amendment revising the definitions of unserved and underserved. In this bill, we're directing the FCC to come up with these definitions, and the FCC's, based on their information they have now, I don't think they have enough empirical data to do so. But if you remember, we have directed that there be the mapping, the broadband inventory map. And my amendment basically says 90 days after enactment, look at that map. After you get your map done, because the map should be completed by then look at your served, underserved, and use that definition. You have 90 days and 45 days to do it. So I sort of have a clarifying legislation to help us out along this, because many of the questions you raised, I had the same questions based upon all the hearings we've had under Mr. Markey's committee on underserved and unserved.
Would you yield for a question, sir? Thank you. I'm curious because I thought I heard you say that the FCC today does not have the empirical data necessary to define underserved and, well, we know unserved, but not underserved.
Correct.
So I'm trying to figure out how they'll do that in the time frame then that you have now referenced in your next amendment.
Because the broadband deployment map, broadband inventory map, is to be completed within the next 3 months. And you'll give us some empirical data, because right now it's sort of a crapshoot, really it is. The information is not accurate. We saw it when we did the Rural Utility Service and not the last Farm Bill before that. Places like Houston was considered underserved and getting the money, where areas like yours and mine were being denied based on a number of factors. So hopefully this broadband inventory map will give us a basis from which to start from, and will clarify unserved and underserved. And I'll yield to Mr. Markey. I think he had a few more comments you want to make.
And I thank the gentleman. The FCC does have information on this already, but what we're going to do is ensure that they get additional information so that they can make this determination between unserved and underserved, and they will do so very quickly after the enactment of this legislation. So we're very sympathetic to the fact that rural America is obviously the most underserved. And that's what is reflected in the stimulus package. The $3 billion right off the top goes there to rural America. And these definitions that Mr. Stupak referred to are in terms of the FCC determining and receiving the data which will determine what is unserved and what is underserved is going to be obtained very quickly. They already have information, and our goal is to get it out there quickly. Obviously, that's the goal of the administration, to see this these projects begin as quickly as possible.
Would the gentleman yield? And I think Mr. Stupak controls the time.
Stupak controls the time.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I just have a question about how quickly then the FCC would be called upon to go through. I assume they would have to go through a rulemaking to come up with this definition, and I wonder how that timeline.
Right. NTIA is supposed to have that map done here hopefully soon.
90 days.
And then they have 9 days after that, 45 days to finalize it.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so you're talking 125 days from NTIA?
When they finish the mapping.
And then the FCC
which will take a little bit more time than I earlier said.
And then the FCC would take those data and begin to develop a definition.
Correct, and then at least we have NTIA and FCC using the same data
to
try to determine underserved and unserved.
But then the FCC would have to go through their rulemaking process. Is there a time limit put on them for that?
No.
Okay.
Would the gentleman yield?
I got 53 seconds, sure.
Mr. Stupak, under your proposed amendment, is there any definitional restriction for the FCC, or do they still just take this information and they decide? And if so, is there any way we could be more directional in determining how they decide, particularly what underserved means? I'm sympathetic to Mr. Markey's point that some areas don't have all the service they might like to have. But my argument would be that every area potentially could say they were underserved, that they need more competition, that they need more options. And so suddenly you've got people that have not only service but multiple providers are getting this grant money for the new competitor, while people who have no service at all are standing there waiting for another allocation of money. And I'd yield back.
Sure. NTIA is supposed to have that inventory map done. That was directed by Congress. They've been working on it, And what we want is once they have that map, so we really know, because everyone claims they're underserved, especially when there's money laying on the table, everybody's underserved. Okay? So if we get this map done, broadband inventory map, NTIA, then we're urging the FCC to use the same information, same data, so we're all speaking from the same text, and then we'll put the money
Would the gentleman
as
yield?
needed. Yes, I'll yield. My time's up, but I'll yield.
Gentleman's time has expired. Who else seeks recognition? Mr. Stearns.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of the amendment, strike the requisite number of words. You know, when you look at this, it's really just saying we're going to set some priorities here, and that I don't think you need a definition for unserved. That means zero. That means nothing, nada. They're not getting anything, and so I don't think that's too difficult to understand. And these people should be a high priority. And I think the gentleman, Mr. Blunt, is just saying that we have so much money and we should look to help the unserved. And for that, I think we should support the amendment, and I think it's a reasonable approach. Thanks.
Further discussion of the amendment?
Mr. Chairman, move.
Mr. Terry, we see.
Yes, sir. Yes. Move to strike the requisite number of words.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, to gentlemen from Michigan and Massachusetts and Florida, I would beg to differ in my observation of how we've come to an understanding in this committee based on the 3 or 4 hearings we had on mapping broadband of what we mean by underserved and unserved. For example, what is typically common in rural areas is that you may have a town of 2,500 people that is served with broadband, but once you get out of the dense, if you can call it denser housing areas, you'll have homes that are unserved, but yet they're still within the territory of that rural provider. So while I think that individual home is unserved, our PSCs or states or someone else may declare that underserved. So we've never really had a hearing, to my knowledge, that focuses on how we distinguish between underserved and unserved. Likewise, when we talk about an urban core, and I'm one of the few guys that sticks up for rural that actually represents urban, you look at the urban core in my district that is served but very much underutilized, but yet I hear in our discussions in some of our past hearings and today that people would assume a definition of underserved in an urban core where no one is using the availability of broadband because of cost or lack of hardware, which is a different issue. And I think there are suggestions within this chairman's mark that we recognize that that's what we mean by underserved in urban core areas, but I'm not sure. And my friend from Michigan, you have a greatest expertise on this area and understand rural versus suburban versus urban. I'll yield to you if you can help me work through some of these, and maybe your amendment helps address them.
Well, I think my amendment would help address it. I wish it would have gone before Mr. Blunt's amendment, and I really don't have much argument with what putting money in unserved versus underserved, but as a Congress, as policymakers, NTIA, FCC, they have nothing to base that on right now. Yeah. And that's why that inventory map will be critically important. You can have one provider, as you pointed out, and still be unserved because you're without the geographic boundaries. And we know the states have come up with different ways of trying to define unserved and underserved. And there's so many different conflicting views out there. And as I said earlier, I think once you put a pot of money out there like we have in this bill, everybody is going to be underserved. At least that'll be the argument. And every one of us we'll be calling the FCC, telling them how underserved or unserved we are to get at that money. So what I'm saying is slow this thing down. Let's get the inventory map out, and let's go off that basis. And I urge the
Reclaiming my
NTIA
time
to
for
do
the
it as
last
quickly as
minute.
possible. Sure,
I agree with you thoroughly. I don't know how we make any policy determinations on what is served, unserved, underserved, adequately served until that map comes out. But I got to tell you, I think it's a real tragedy of transferring our ability to make those policy decisions outside of this committee. I've seen the FCC rule that areas of Mississippi are unserved when we have houses in the middle of Nebraska and the Sandhills that are 50 miles apart that by the FCC's definition weren't qualified. So frankly, just handing this off to the FCC is an atrocious abrogation of our policy duties. And with that, I'm going to at least go with the with Mr. Blunt's amendment here, but I don't know how we make any decisions here today when we have no clue what the definitions of unserved and underserved are.
With the gentleman yield.
Gentleman's time is
My time has expired, Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes Mr. Dingell.
Mr. Chairman, this was a matter that I discussed in my opening remarks, and I want to commend my colleagues for their interest in their comments. I think that to leave this kind of a decision to the FCC with no guidance poses a risk of several things. First of all, inaction by the FCC, which is notorious for not acting on matters of great importance with proper speed. Second of all, we're giving them no understanding of what either underserved or unserved might happen to be, or any of the other nouns or adverbs, or adjectives that might relate to the level of service. Having said these two things, I think we need to give some instruction to them in the report. I think the committee is capable of doing that through its staff. But I would urge that there will be strong need for legislative oversight over this particular matter to make sure that the FCC does not tranquilly go to rest on this matter, or so that the FCC does not simply screw the matter up as they so regularly do.
Gentleman from Michigan, yield to me.
I'm glad to yield to the chair.
I thank you for the points you raise, and I want to indicate that since Mr. Stupak will have an amendment on this very area, which I think makes more sense than the Blunt amendment, I'm going to oppose the Blunt amendment. RUS funds the rural areas already. It's appropriate that our bill also fund less rural areas and promote higher speeds. So we have percentages which are really aspirational. They're not hard and fast. We'll have more data to define some of these areas. There may be more funding for unserved areas depending on applications. But I think we need to focus not just on unserved, but underserved, so we can get a higher speeds and promote job growth, because this bill is to promote jobs. And we can, I think, in the process of all of this, see that the areas that are unserved as well as underserved get attention. But the real purpose is to get the jobs out there, and I think we ought to recognize what
the gentleman
Mr. Stupak is proposing.
I have the time, but I'll be glad to yield to whoever wants.
Yeah.
Well, then I yield back
Chairman,
the balance of my time.
Chairman, I was asking if you'd yield to me for a moment. Lee Terry.
Mr. Dingell,
way on the other side.
I'll be glad to yield to Mr. Terry.
Thank you. In response, I just want to add out a little bit. I've done a lot of work and with the RUS, and it's part of their rural economic development, and that's really what we're talking about here. But I've got to tell you, at least in almost every rural state I've been to and looked into, the RUS has made little difference in rolling out broadband in rural areas. It has been the incumbent small telcos who have rolled out advanced services. And it's interesting in small towns, very small telcos, that USF has been more helpful to them than RUS to those communities. In fact, my one experience with RUS is that they came into Omaha, or an applicant was awarded tens of millions of dollars to roll out a wireless broadband in such small towns as Elkhorn, Nebraska, what's in my district. Elkhorn, probably about 20,000 people, is actually inside the Omaha city limits and has the choice of maybe 5 or 6 different broadband carriers. So the unfortunate part is that we may assume that the Rural Utility Service, RUS, economic development grants for broadband are going to the smallest of communities. The realities are they're being used in suburbia to compete. And so I think if we're going to rely on the other $2 or $3 billion that RUS, we need to engage in the debate about whether they're actually going to be used in rural services or not. And I'll yield back my time. I just wanted to help educate my colleagues here on the difficulties I've had with RUS trying to get them to actually focus on rural areas. And I'll yield back my chairman, the time back to Mr. Dingell.
Gentleman's time has expired. Further discussion. Mr. Stupak, do you want to offer your amendment as a substitute?
Mr. Chairman, I was just going to ask, would it be appropriate, since we're getting these definitions, maybe it would be appropriate to offer my amendment as a substitute to the Blunt amendment, if there, of course, unanimous consent.
Let me ask if there's any objection to that. Yeah. Mr. Blunt, do you have any objection?
I object. I object.
You do object.
I'm inclined to. There's no time here. I object.
Okay. Ms. Escher.
I just want to say a few words about the amendment. I appreciate the gentleman offering it because I think that any kind of discussion on broadband is an exceedingly important one. Our country has fallen so far behind that it is a great national source of embarrassment to us. I mean, where the administration, the previous administration, if there was one person that had broadband in a zip code, they included everyone in it. So, you know, I mean, on a bipartisan basis, we know we have a problem. I don't see why we need to get hung up on these definitions. If someone isn't served, if there isn't any broadband, you don't need a definition for that. There simply isn't any broadband wherever it is in East Jesus, USA. All right? Now, on the other part of it, in terms of underserved, in 45 days or less, the FCC can come up with a definition for it. I think the important thing is here is that the legislation calls for and contains $3 billion for this particular area, for both underserved and non-served. That's the great news. So I don't think we should get ourselves on the ropes in here. I really don't. I think we should take a deep breath and be sensible and say, hallelujah, part of this is being addressed. My issue in all of this is that no one should think that with underserved and non-served and $3 billion that we're correcting and going to bring up broadband penetration, wide broadband penetration to every place in our country and address speeds is going to be addressed by this whole issue, because it's not. And so that really belongs over on the tax side with Ways and Means. I've made a proposal in terms of bonds for broadband in our country. If we could do bonds for the Transcontinental Railroad, we should be doing broadband bonds for our country. So I'd be happy to yield to Mr. Markey.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding. Just a little bit of history, just so that we can all feel good about ourselves here. When In 2001, the United States was ranked second in the world in broadband deployment, speed, accessibility, pricing. We've now slipped to 16th in the world. Now, over the last 2 years, as the subcommittee chairman, working with the Republicans, we put together, based upon the Connect Kentucky program, to do broadband mapping for the state of Kentucky, a national broadband mapping bill. Now, the reason that I did that and the reason that we worked with the minority on it was obviously rural America was not being served, and that was a great concern which I had, which is why I introduced the legislation and had the whole series of hearings that we had here in 2007. It was to find where America is not served at all and where it is underserved. And that bill passed out of this committee unanimously to put together that national broadband map, and it was signed by President Bush. So my goal was not to worry about the wealthiest communities in my district in Boston, obviously. It was to worry about the unserved rural parts of our country and the underserved parts of suburban and urban America. That was my goal. Now, what Mr. Stupak's amendment will do is to flesh that out even further. Kevin Martin, however, to our credit again, took note of what we were doing legislatively and initiated his own process to begin to gather more information, which is going to help us to ensure that we expedite this process. So in this distribution of money, actually, the bill before us, which the Obama administration put together, recommends, obviously, that half of it right off the top goes to rural America. But then, for the other half, which is under our jurisdiction, has this other distribution that includes underserved as well. And there are a lot of people in America who aren't in rural America who are underserved. In other words, a person who's underserved should not have to wait until the last unserved person has their access. There should be a way in which suburban and urban America, where it is underserved, are also beneficiaries. So we started this process, this committee, not the Senate, not the Obama team, not the Bush administration. We started it in this committee 2 years ago, and this is the culmination day with, I think, a very fair split in terms of where the money goes, but with 45 days at the FCC to make these definitions so that we can get it out there to rural America as quickly as possible. So we should feel good about what we did because all the leadership came out of this committee on a bipartisan basis, Mr. Stearns, Mr. Barton, Mr. Dingell, myself. So I yield.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Are we ready for the question? Let's see. Mr. Boyer is next in seniority.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple of things are concerning me, even about the debate. Number one, Mr. Markey, when you led off in your opposition to this amendment, you accused Mr. Blunt and defined his amendment as calling it a rural service first amendment. Well, that beckons then that you define your own legislation then as a city first. That's what's before us. Now, what concerns me most is that when we make judgments on policy, I think that virtues and values ought to be pretty important because we're doing it for a country. And as we do this for a country and you look at virtues and values, we say, you know what? There are certain things that we do that by policy, it's for good conduct and good behavior. There are other things out there in our society we recognize as bad conduct and bad behavior. Now, why am I bringing this up? Because that for which is bad behavior, we call it shameful. Now, what's shameful? We recognize that things that are shameful not necessarily may be criminal. There may not be criminal culpability, but shameful conduct, we could see it by maybe you go, you're having lunch, and 100 people are to be served. And so what? 75% of the people have already gone through the lunch line. 25% of the people haven't even been fed yet. And the other 75% say, you know, I need a little bit more dessert. I didn't get enough meat. I need more vegetables. So they cut in line before the other 25% have even been fed. We all recognize that as shameful conduct and behavior. Now, with regard to our allocations, this committee, we didn't say with regard to handing out the coupons with the digital for DTV, we didn't say we're going to hand out coupons only to where the areas that are selling the most the most high-definition TVs. I mean, come on, I just want to take a time out here. I agree with Mr. Dingell. We should, and with the others that have said, let's not send this off to the FCC and let them decide. See, someone has already made a judgment and are unwilling to come publicly and say what they really mean when they put this together.
With the gentleman,
meaning that an allocation decision has been made. When an allocation decision has been made, then somebody already has expressed their intent.
With the
now,
gentleman
Mr. Markey
yield?
has been. Hold on a second.
Okay.
Mr. Markey has said to us, well, wait a minute. Look what they're doing with regard to ag. He is fighting for the cities. What we should be fighting for is to make sure that people get covered in our society, whether they're an inner city area that is unserved or in a rural area that is unserved. I also would say to the gentlelady that I'll yield to, definitions are pretty important. Definitions are important. You may not think they're important.
I do.
But if you're going to allocate money, definitions are important. And we ought to decide in this committee with regard to these allocations. I'll yield to the gentlelady.
I appreciate it. I appreciate the gentleman yielding. I think all members should turn to page 2 of what is in front of us. Line 5, grants authorized. Line 6, in general, the NTIA is authorized to carry out a program to award grants to eligible entities for the non-recurring costs associated with the deployment of broadband infrastructure. This is very important, going to the point that the gentleman just spoke to. Lines 11 and 12. Broadband infrastructure in rural, suburban, and urban areas in accordance with the requirements of this section. So they are, the only point I want to make is that we're not putting any part of our country ahead of another.
Let me reclaim my time. Let me reclaim my time.
Great.
We are. That's what
well,
I say.
This is what the words of the legislation are. So,
I'd say the gentleman, we are. Matter of fact, to Mr. Markey's last comments, what I would say is, if that is your real intent, the real intent that I wrote down your quote, we should not have to wait until the last unserved is served in an underserved area. Well, then, if that's how you really believe, flip the allocation. Just flip the allocation. Make the allocation 75% for the unserved and 25% for the underserved. And I yield to Mr. Markey for his comment with regard to his intent.
Would the gentleman just briefly yield again? Just remember, in talking about your unfed, remember there's in an adjacent ballroom here. The Agriculture Committee is going to be serving 50% of all the money off the top to unserved America, meaning rural America. It's the Rural Utility Service. So it starts there. Here, we're just adding underserved as well, reflecting the fact that a large percentage of even this $3 billion is going to rural as well, unserved, but that the underserved should also be factored in, because obviously this economic development for our country.
I want value-based decisions, Mr. Markey. That's the only thing I hope for.
Gentleman's time has expired. Further discussion of the amendment. Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I would yield my time to Mr. Walden.
Thank you very much. I appreciate my colleague from Michigan doing that. I want to go back through some of the timelines here, because at the back of this substitute, it talks about the FCC having 45 days. If you go to page 11, that says that the FCC shall define underserved and wireless voice service, all these things, and it sets up 45-day requirements for definition. Now, we've heard from Mr. Stupak that NTIA probably won't have their mapping done for 125 to 165 days, something like that. But before the maps are done, the FCC is supposed to write definitions. 30 days, no more than 30 days after the FCC is done, the states are supposed to submit. If you look at page 3, not later than 75 days after the date of enactment of this section, each state intending to participate in the program under this section shall submit to NTI this very complex report in order to qualify. So we're going to give our states 30 days after we've given the FCC 45 days in order for them to even participate. Now, I don't know about your state. Mine's pretty good and aggressive. We've got a great PUC, but that's a pretty tight timeline to meet all the other requirements in this bill, including trying to define, and maybe somebody can help me with this one, on page 8, line 8, section 3, this notion of contains concrete plans for enhancing computer ownership or computer literacy in the area. I've not seen the word concrete used in the context of developing a plan, and I wonder what that's all about and where that came from. And I concur with my colleague from Indiana. There have been decisions made, apparently behind closed doors without the minority here involved in those discussions, to decide that 75% should go to the underserved, and 25% to the unserved. That's a policy decision we're sending NTI's way as a proposal, not a shall, I recognize, but you'll have them back here to beat them up pretty bloody if they exceed that in any way. We're delegating the decision-making to FCC on the definitions. And when we're spending $3 billion in a matter of minutes here, we're sending it to an agency where there have been 5, and I believe are there now 4 commissioners currently serving, so it's deadlocked right now at the FCC. So we're down to 3. So it's not, so 3 unelected commissioners at the FCC are going to be given the authority, if you vote for this, to define how to spend $3 billion. If we put all the work into this, why aren't we writing the definition? What's wrong with that? We're the legislators. And I think of all the hearings we've had and oversight hearings we've conducted where we beat up agencies for not following our intent, we need to give them the intent clearly right here, right now. It's our responsibility. I yield to the gentleman. I yield.
Reclaiming my time, I would yield to Mr. Terry of Nebraska.
Thank you. And just to help educate my colleagues here, with the RUS dollars that's under the Ag title, there is no definition under the Ag title of underserved and served. And so under that purposes, or this discussion of, okay, well, the real rural dollars are going to be within the RUS. Let me again explain that I've studied the RUS in their broadband because they wanted to come into areas of Omaha, highly dense areas, suburban areas that were already covered by at least 3 or 4 different carriers. Their argument to RUS to get these funds is, well, we have to go into the dense areas before we can go into the less dense areas, and that was their building model. Well, the whole point, what was confusing to me under the award was that they got to start building in their wireless networks within, broadband networks within Omaha, including one that's right smack almost in the dab of middle of Omaha that's really a blue-collar area that has, I mean, if it's got any animals, it's cats and dogs. And they were going to set up in those areas, but they didn't have a timetable of when they were really going to go into any rural areas. It confused me why they were receiving government grants under a business model like that. But just to point out, as we're discussing this, Mr. Markey, is that there's no guarantees that the RUS funds are going to be used responsibly for rural America.
Gentleman's time has expired. Are we ready for the question? Mr. Shattuck.
Mr. Chairman, I simply want to make the point that I think this discussion is a very worthwhile discussion and very productive, and I think it illustrates the complexity of the legislation that's before us. It seems to me we are debating very serious policies that affect millions of Americans, that allocate scarce resources, which has been pointed out earlier, don't come from today's taxpayers, but will be borrowed and then will become a burden on our children, and quite frankly, even on our grandchildren. And I'm pleased we're having a discussion, but I think it's important that we allocate enough time to all of the issues raised in this legislation, and I think this is a critically important one. And with that, I yield to Mr. Blunt.
Thank you, Mr. Shattuck. Just a couple of points as final points I'd like to make, Mr. Chairman. One is, it's interesting to me that part of this debate is that this committee, the Energy and Commerce Committee, would be ceding responsibility willingly to the Agriculture Committee in defining these areas or to the FCC in defining these areas. This committee should do that work. I believe this committee is better prepared to do that work not only than any other committee of Congress, but also than any appointed people in a partially populated Federal Communications Commission right now. And what does underserved mean? The chairman mentioned earlier that it may mean you don't have enough, a high enough level of speed yet. Certainly, people who are going to apply for grants would like to have federal money to compete in areas that somebody else is already serving, because the market study's already been done, then the more difficult area of serving others. I mean, why don't we define what underserved means? Does it mean you only have one competitor? By definition, it means somebody's providing the service. So why doesn't this committee say in areas that don't have yet 3 competitors, 75% of the money can go before it can go to areas that are underserved? That's really the spirit of this amendment. I appreciate the time we've had to debate it, and I yield back to the gentleman.
Reclaiming my time, I only want to make the point that while this bill spends hundreds of billions of dollars, we're talking here about not an insignificant amount of money. We're talking about $3 billion, which we're handing off to a commission to spend. I would suggest that those are important decisions. I've seen us fight on the floor over much smaller amounts of money. It seems to me that we ought to be setting those priorities, and I would associate myself with the comments of Mr. Booyer in terms of who ought to be served first, and whether or not some people are entitled to additional service before others have gotten even their first round. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Are we ready for the question? All those in favor of the Blunt amendment will say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like a recorded vote.
You want a recorded vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Waxman?
No.
Mr. Waxman, no. Mr. Dingell? No. Mr. Dingell, no. Mr. Markey? No. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Boucher? Mr. Pallone? Mr. Gordon? No. Mr. Gordon, no. Mr. Rush? Ms. Eshoo? No. Ms. Eshoo, no. Mr. Stupak? No. Mr. Stupak, no. Mr. Engel? Mr. Green? No. Mr. Green, no. Ms. DeGette? Ms. DeGette, no. Mrs. Capps? Mrs. Capps, no. Mr. Doyle? Mr. Doyle, no. Ms. Harmon? Ms. Harmon, no. Ms. Schakowsky? Ms. Schakowsky, no. Mr. Gonzalez? Mr. Gonzalez, no. Mr. Inslee? Mr. Inslee, no. Ms. Baldwin? Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Ross? Mr. Weiner? No. Mr. Weiner, no. Mr. Matheson? Mr. Matheson, no. Mr. Butterfield? No. Mr. Butterfield, no. Mr. Melanson? Mr. Melanson, no. Mr. Barrow? Mr. Barrow, no. Mr. Hill? No. Mr. Hill, no. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui, no. Mrs. Christensen? No. Mrs. Christensen, no. Ms. Castor? Ms. Castor, no. Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. Sarbanes, no. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut? No. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut, no. Mr. Space? No. Mr. Space, no. Mr. McNerney? No. Mr. McNerney, no. Ms. Sutton? No. Ms. Sutton, no. Mr. Braley? Mr. Welch? No. Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Barton? Yes. Mr. Barton, aye. Mr. Hall? Aye. Mr. Hall, aye. Mr. Upton? Aye. Mr. Upton, aye. Mr. Stearns? Mr. Stearns, aye. Mr. Deal? Mr. Deal, aye. Mr. Whitfield? Mr. Whitfield, aye. Mr. Shimkus? Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Shattuck? Mr. Shattuck, aye. Mr. Blunt? Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Booyer? Mr. Booyer, aye. Mr. Radonovich? Mr. Pitts? Mr. Pitts, aye. Ms. Bono Mack? Ms. Bonomack, aye. Mr. Walden? Mr. Walden, aye. Mr. Terry? Mr. Terry, aye. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers, aye. Mrs. Myrick? Mrs. Myrick, aye. Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania? Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, aye. Ms. Blackburn? Ms. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Gingrey? Mr. Gingrey, aye. Mr. Scalise? Mr. Scalise, aye.
Other members seeking recognition? Mr. Ross? Mr. Ross votes no.
Mr. Ross votes no.
Mr. Pallone?
Votes no.
Mr. Pallone votes no.
Gentleman from California, Mr. Radonovich?
Mr. Radonovich votes aye.
Mr. Rush?
Mr. Rush votes
No.
Mr. Rush votes no. Thank you.
Have all members been recorded? The clerk will announce the vote.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, the ayes were 33. The ayes were 23 and the noes were 33.
The amendment is not agreed to. Mr. Stupak?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
At the desk.
Yes, I have an amendment at the desk. It's amendment number 2.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. Gentleman recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as I said earlier, I wished I could have offered this one before Mr. Blunt's amendment. I think Mr. Blunt's amendment was well intended, but lacked some specificity, and hopefully we can bring some further specificity to what is unserved and underserved areas. Mr. Dingle and Mr. Terry made a lot of good comments last time about the areas where there's no definitions out there, and we do not want to leave it to the FCC. So what my amendment requires that the FCC review and revise its definitions of unserved and underserved areas after completion of the broadband inventory map. Currently, our federal agencies do lack the empirical data on the status of broadband deployment in this country. So it's my concern that the definitions the FCC will create to designate what is an unserved or underserved area may not be accurate. Congress addressed a similar issue with the Rural Utility Service Broadband Program under the Farm Bill. And thanks to Mr. Markey's legislation on broadband map in 2007, we had a number of hearings on it. Congress had input on that broadband map legislation Mr. Markey passed. And also in the Rural Utility Service Broadband Program, since I helped write the program 6-7 years ago, this was the first time we've had a chance to reauthorize it. And with the reauthorization, because of input from members and hearings we had, in the Rural Utility Service Broadband Program, they do provide some criteria, specific criteria, such as changes were made to tighten up the areas to be eligible to receive loans in the RUS in a way that should exclude suburban areas that are already well served. As examples Mr. Terry brought up, areas are not eligible if they receive service by 3 or more broadband providers, or more than 75% of the households may obtain affordable broadband service from at least one incumbent provider, and the areas are contiguous to an urban center, are of at least 50,000, nor have a population exceeding 20,000. In other words, you can't be more than 20,000, but you can't be adjacent to an area of 50,000 population. So we do have some criteria to go by. But prior to the Farm Bill, funding was going to areas that met the criteria issued by the Department of Ag, but were not truly rural in nature, and I brought up the subdivision within Houston. So what we're doing here is when we revise the definition of the RUS in the Farm Bill to tighten the criteria of eligibility and more efficiently target our funds to areas that need them. The FCC should undergo a similar process upon completion of the broadband deployment map by the NTIA. That way we can ensure that areas that are truly underserved and unserved receive future funding. We've argued basically this amendment on the Blunt amendment, so I just ask my colleagues to support this amendment to bring some specificity and uniformity of what is unserved and underserved based upon the criteria of the broadband deployment map. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Stupak. Is there a discussion or opposition? Mr. Barton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I didn't speak on the Blunt amendment, and I'm not going to speak at length on the Stupak amendment, but I think what Mr. Blunt said on his amendment bears repeating on this amendment. If we as a committee feel like there should, be grants to underserved areas of America, we ought to put it in the statute. We don't need to let the Commission have a study. We could have a debate in this committee or subcommittee and then decide if underserved means one provider that has less than 50% market penetration, so be it. If it means two providers, none of which is dominant, so be it. But to say that, I understand the gentleman from Michigan's intent here, and it is an improvement in the underlying bill because at least he requires there be some definition, and that's a good thing, not a bad thing. But I think there are enough bright minds on this committee, maybe even one or two on the minority side of the aisle, that we could work this out and put it in the statute. So I would, I'm not saying I'm really opposed to this. I don't see why we don't do what Mr. Blunt said, is decide what we want, a definition of underserved, and put it in the bill. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Are we ready for the question on the...
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized. Gentleman from Oregon.
I'd just like to, if the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Stupak, could help me walk through the timelines here. Your amendment would say that not later than 3 months then, after the date the NTIA makes broadband inventory map available, the FCC would go back through and revise their definitions accordingly. Is that the crux of this?
That's the crux of it. After the 90 days, they have 45 more days to get through the rules and regulations.
Then what impact does that have on the underlying bill on page 3, where the states are only given 75 days after enactment to write and submit their plans? Because it looks to me like we've just moved the goalposts on them with a requirement of the FCC to redefine underserved. Well, hell, the whole bill. And yet the states within 75 days of enactment are supposed to have their plans in place. So is that going to require, if the FCC changes the definition after NTIA comes in, then aren't the states going to have to revise all their submitted plans?
Not necessarily. Just of the states right now, I think both you and Mr. Terry both point out that you have different criteria that your state uses, probably different than Michigan right now. Until we get an inventory map, until the Markey legislation we passed in 2007, until we have that information, they'll probably end up continue to put out these grants the way they have been right now, which quite honestly has been based upon political influence and earmarks. So this administration is trying to say we're not going to do political influence or earmarks. Let's base it on something.
Reclaiming
you're
my
right.
time,
States
though.
are going to have to look at it differently.
Right, I understand that, but the language that we're putting into statute says not later than 75 days after the date of enactment of this section, each state intending to participate in the program under this section shall submit to the NTIA a report indicating the geographic areas of the state which, and then it goes through, and included in that is which wireless voice service in unserved areas and underserved areas, the same for broadband.
Correct.
That definition is what we've been debating this morning, that's going to be defined by the FCC, now further revised after the maps come in, and yet in order to participate, the states have to submit this plan in 75 days describing what areas of theirs are underserved, but then we're going to change the definition on them. So they're going to have to resubmit their plans in order to qualify because the definition could change.
Well, hopefully once they submit their plans, you're trying to deploy the money, they're not going to let them wait for a year or so before do it, that we'll deploy the money. Do they have to resubmit the plans? I guess that's an administrator's judgment, but I would say no. But look, right now we don't have anything federally. How we've been doing it?
All right.
Based upon the applications.
I just want.
I
know that I'm going to hear from my public utility commissioner, my governor, or somebody that says, "Doggone you guys! You told us to go down this route. The FCC in 45 days gave us a definition. We went to work and we crashed out in 30 days a plan that details everything, including a concrete plan for computer acquisition." And then you've come back and you've changed the description of what underserved is, and now our plan won't be in compliance.
No, I don't think that's at all. I would hope the NTIA, as you're applying, if Oregon applies for a grant here and to give specific information, that will help them, NTIA, to do their broadband
But
map.
again, reclaiming my time, everything else in the underlying document talks about whatever definition the FCC puts forward in 45 days, the state only has 30 days to write their plan, and everything's predicated on their definition of the original FCC definition. And I think it's going to set up a real mess. I just want to put that on the record. Yes, certainly.
But, I mean, right now you got 50 different ways of defining. If you look, each state does it differently.
I don't argue that point.
So after you have your standard, shouldn't a state then comply to the federal rules? Yeah.
Right, but what we're doing is creating one standard in 45 days after.
Right, and then you get 30 days after. You get a little pressure on the states, right.
Well, but wait, because then you're going to come back with your amendment with the new NTIA data from the maps.
Correct.
And have the FCC review that and come up with a revised definition of underserved. And now the states are going to have to go through and revise all their plans because we didn't set the definition here right now.
And while the FCC is doing their revisions, I'm sure, knowing your interest in this area, you'll be helping the FCC make those determinations. It's going to give all of us an opportunity to make it.
Well, my interests aside, and I would be more than happy to be cooperative on all of it. I don't know, maybe 21 years in small business, I used to get really angry when the government moved the goalposts on me. And I'm afraid that's what we're setting up here, is the government's going to send the states down this direction and this path, and then in whatever timeline is in 3 months, the FCC is going to change where the goalposts are, and there's going to have to be a complete rewriting of these state plans.
Right, but when we try to kick that field goal, we'll have one field goal as opposed to 50 different field goals, and maybe we get some uniformity in definitions of unserved, underserved.
Yeah.
Rexman?
Our time has expired. Any further discussion on this side? Mr. Boyer?
Mr. Rexman, I have an amendment to the amendment, and the amendment is at the desk. I have a second-degree amendment. If you could pass out the amendment.
Reserving a point of order.
Gentleman reserves a point of order. I don't think it's, I don't think, if the gentleman would permit, I don't think a second-degree amendment would be permitted because we didn't make the amendment in the nature of a substitute, the base text. And when Mr. Stupak tried to use his amendment as a substitute amendment to Mr. Blunt, there was objection. So if you wish to ask unanimous consent, you could do that, but otherwise, without unanimous consent, I don't think you'd be permitted to offer it as a substitute amendment.
So you will you're going to rule out of order a second-degree amendment?
We have as
my amendment already is second-degree amendment to the chairman's amendment. We're working off that one.
This would be
third degree.
You're correct.
Which is not appropriate.
All right, I would ask unanimous consent.
Well, wait, parliamentary inquiry.
Yes, gentleman stays parliamentary inquiry.
When we began the markup, my staff indicates to me that you offered an amendment in the nature of a substitute as a base text. Is that correct?
Well, I offered an amendment in the nature of a substitute for the purposes of amendment, and then I asked unanimous consent that all amendments that were drafted to the bill be considered as designed to the amendment to the nature of the substitute.
We agreed with that. But your initial request, you did offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Yes.
My parliamentarian says if that's the case, Mr. Booyer doesn't need unanimous consent because the amendment under the rules is in order.
Well, that's
now, I'm not saying that that's true. I'm just saying that's what my parliamentarian
my parliamentarian is telling me something different. I would like any way we can proceed in the most orderly way possible. Mr. Stupak?
Mr. Chairman, well, you offered an amendment in nature of substitute. It hasn't been voted on. It's still an amendment, still pending.
Still pending.
Yeah, we haven't accepted it yet. If we would have accepted it, would have been a substitute. We have not accepted it as a substitute, so mine's a second-degree amendment to the Waxman amendment. Right. So now you're becoming to a third degree. And
Well,
Mr. Chairman, depending whether or not it's a hybrid.
There's a question for unanimous consent. Now, Mr. Stupak, this is an amendment amendment to your amendment. The question is not whether you approve it, but are you willing to let it be offered as a second degree to yours?
No, we've beat this one to death. No, I object.
So let's dispose of Mr. Stupak's amendment first.
Well, then, may I be recognized to speak?
Yes, gentleman's recognized.
Move to strike the last word. And I think what would be helpful for the members is for the two parliamentarians to please contact our head parliamentarian to find out, because a lot of business for which we do here in Congress, Chairman will offer that substitute, and then we go through the amendment process. And even when I chaired on Veterans Affairs, I would permit a secondary amendment on a substitute. So I would like for all of us, for our own edification, I think it would be helpful to us.
Mr. Chairman,
parliamentary
clarification.
Gentlemen,
all right, I yield. Well, I no longer have the time then if it's parliamentary inquiry.
Mr. Barton, state your parliamentary inquiry.
Well, I'm a stickler for rules and due process, but what I said earlier was an error. You did not offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute. You did not offer a manager's amendment, so it does require unanimous consent. So Mr. Stupak is within his rights to object to the unanimous consent request, because you didn't offer a manager's amendment in the nature of a substitute, which I was told initially that you did. You did not do that, so it does require unanimous consent.
Okay, thanks. In the meantime, Mr. Boyer wished to be recognized to speak on the pending Stupak amendment, and gentleman's recognized.
Thank you. And is all that time counted against me, Mr. Chairman?
No, I'm going to start you all over.
Thank you. I want to compliment Mr. Stupak, because you're trying to you're helping. You're trying to make something here. You're trying to be very helpful, and I agree with you that having this map is extremely important for us to be able to make good judgments. And so what I was about to do, Mr. Stupak, in amending your amendment is when you say that we shall, you're going to extend to the FCC then, based on this map, that you can revise the definitions based then on the data. If you're going to revise the definitions, then why wouldn't you also then revise the allocation? Because that's what's so extremely important. And so what I was going to propose in your, to amend your amendment would be to revise the allocation. I guess what I'll do now, since you objected to that amendment, is I will wait and pause and see the outcome of your amendment, and then may offer my own then amendment. But Mr. Stupak, I would just like to enter this colloquy with you, is that because those definitions are extremely important, and I can't in good conscience place myself to defend the 75% that want to put themselves back in the food line. And so if we want to make sure that everyone is covered, would it not be logical then for us to, Mr. Stupak, to then say, if we're going to revise definitions based on the map, that we should also take a second look at the allocation? And I yield to the gentleman.
I wasn't in the room when the allocations came up. There are two different sources. If I had my way, it'd be 100%, and it'd go to the 1st Congressional District of Michigan. And that's why we're not all in the room. I'm sure there's some logic to 75, 25, 80, 20 as we see in this legislation, but I'm not privy to those discussions, so I guess I really couldn't tell you, to be honest, Steve.
Well,
I yield back.
Reclaiming my time, do you know who was in the room?
Nope.
Well, then, if we're trying to make logically based decisions, that's what you're doing here, would the gentleman agree that we should also revisit the allocation percentage based off the outcome of the map, Mr. Stupak? I yield to you.
Again, I think if we take a look at the full bill, I think there's allocations made, and I think there's some logic to it. Should we redo it? No, I don't think that's in the purview of this committee.
So, I'm sorry, I didn't hear the...
No, I don't think we really should do a reallocation. Why? Because I think we have an administration, we have a Senate, we have the House. Leadership has all conferred and put together this package, and there's some things I think we can. Remember, these are not hard set goals. It's got to be 75, 25. Aspirational goals is a new one I heard today, and I aspire to get all of it to my district.
All right, we'll reclaim my time. it doesn't, in the bill, it doesn't say aspirational goal, nor does it intend for it to be an aspirational goal. It actually states the 75-25. It uses the word shall, and then it uses some language. Let me move to it. What, to the extent possible or something like that?
I think it says shall seek.
Shall
That's where I get aspirational goal, shall seek.
Wow, boy, we're just going to abdicate a lot of our responsibilities over to the FCC. I just pause and remember when Republicans were in the majority, when you were fighting in the minority, you would never have taken this position that you're taking today. And I'm really stunned. I think one of the things that we have to do, and Republicans now when we find ourselves in the minority, we also have to be very careful in keeping ourselves to what are your values, what are your principles, what do you believe in the best interests of the country, and I believe you should be doing the very same thing. Don't fight one way when you're in the minority, but when you're in the majority, then you do something completely different. Definitions are important, allocations are important, and I'm going to go back to my comment about value-based policy judgments for a country. We shouldn't be saying to the other 75%, it's okay to cut into the food line before the other 25 people have even gotten fed yet. And that's what we're doing with regard to broadband services. And I applaud Mr. Stupak. You recognize that. You're trying to make that kind of change. But when it comes to then the allocation of the money needs to follow the map. So I applaud the gentleman for his intentions. I yield to the gentleman if he would like that.
Well, thanks. And again, a little flippant there on the amounts. I all want to go to my district. I think we all want to. But what my amendment's trying to do is build off what we did in the last Congress. When we had the Markey legislation, we had a number of hearings on unserved, underserved, and we finally got something to say, okay, let's do a broadband deployment map so we all know what we're going from, what we're all working off of. Even the FCC thought it was a good idea because we had a number of hearings with the FCC in there. Right now, the FCC is down to 3 members, and so I'm just saying, look, let's build off what we've been doing for the last 2 years under the leadership of Mr. Markey and in this and deploy it that way. Maybe after we get that map, you might be right, Mr. Booyer. Maybe we should reallocate the 75-25. You may be right. I want to take it one step at a time. Let's get a map. Let's get some common definitions we can all use from, and let's work from there. And that's why, in a way, I know it's a new definition, shall seek. We call it aspirational, but gives us some room to maneuver in the future, and I appreciate what you're trying to do. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Move to strike the last word.
Well, let me announce to the members, we have a 2-hour limit on this committee print. I know of a couple of amendments, and we'll probably have votes. Of course, we won't count that time. So unless it's really urgent, I would hope we can get to the vote, but I'm not going to cut anybody off. Does anybody feel they absolutely must speak on the Stupak amendment?
Yes, I do. I'm sorry.
Mr. Terry.
I move to strike the requisite number of words, and I'm not trying to cause problems. I'm extremely frustrated at so many different levels here. First of all, I've been working for 3 years on trying to make sure that we have a comprehensive, logical broadband policy that does do what we're talking about here, and that's, you know, kind of the man on the moon big picture thing. And to have 3 years of beating my head against a wall here, of trying to make it comprehensive and coordinated, and then to do it in a matter of 4 hours without any input, discussion, coordination. Let's just throw $6 billion and not question how it's done or coordinated. It makes no sense to me and frustrates me to the core. Bart, I like what you're doing here, but it doesn't get to what the real issues are here, although we in Congress can't decide what underserved and unserved means until we get this data. The FCC can't. But that doesn't mean that we punt to the FCC on these type of issues, because it is going to mean in Nebraska, will that one house out in the middle of nowhere that's being unserved is underserved by some definition or not? That's a huge policy decision that this committee should decide. Now, I'm curious, Mr. Markey or Bart, somebody, do you know if the RUS $3 billion is all grant dollars or loan dollars?
The gentleman yield?
Yes, I yield to Ms. Markey.
It is all grant money.
Thank you. That's helpful to some extent, because most of RUS is loan dollars, so we don't get really anywhere. The other point, or one thing I would add that I do know, is that under current law, there is no obligation to use RUS dollars for unserved areas. So does anybody, Mr. Markey, would you know if under what the Ag Committee is doing that they designate that a portion of their dollars has to be used for unserved areas, whatever that may mean by the FCC? And I would yield to you.
And I apologize to you. I do not know what the Agriculture Committee is doing on that.
I would appreciate that. Well, that begs the question.
Although all the money goes to rural America, okay? So I assume on the Agriculture...
No, it doesn't.
Just assuming on the Agriculture Committee that there would be a lot of pressure to make sure that that was done correctly.
Well, that may be a true statement that there'd be a lot of pressure, but from experience, by law, they're not required and have seen fit to abrogate that when necessary. So I guess the bottom line here, and then I'll yield back, is that this is a monumental undertaking that we need to take, but doing it in a haphazard, uncoordinated way and just saying the common goal here is to throw $6 billion at the problem and quit asking any questions simply is too frustrating to handle. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. We'll now proceed to the vote on the Stupak amendment. All those in favor of the Stupak amendment will say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Mr. Barton, you have an amendment? If the gentleman...
I don't mind waiting until after we go eat, or if you...
Okay, let's do this. We have votes on the floor, and we will take an extra 15 minutes after the vote is completed so that members may get something to eat, and then we will reconvene to further consider this committee print for another 30, let's make it 40 minutes. And after that, we're going to conclude the debate and vote on the committee print. So let's figure we'll be back here at 2 o'clock.